Hey guys, tonight we begin. Tonight's boring history for sleep whisks us to a windswept Victorian lighthouse, where our keeper rises before dawn to trim wicks, polish brass lenses, and log every passing ship beneath a silent sky. If you truly enjoy this gentle voyage through time, feel free to like and subscribe, and share your location and local time in the comments so we can build our comforting, global bedtime community. Now dim the lights, flip on a fan to stir the air, fluff your pillows, and settle in for a lullaby of lantern clicks and distant gull cries. Let anticipation drift like sea mist around you as we prepare for the calm, repetitive rhythms of a bygone era. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. The hush is nearly absolute. Even as your eyelids flutter open, you can feel the weight of silence pressing against the rough-hewn walls of the lantern chamber. The lantern room lies dark, its great Fresnel lens awaiting the kindling of flame, but for now everything remains draped in pre-dawn gloom. Only the rhythmic breath of the sea, measured and patient, seems to pulse through the floorboards. Outside, waves break against jagged rocks in the blackness, each crash muffled by distance, yet resonating deep in your chest like the toll of a distant bell. You lie for a moment longer, senses alert, savoring the quiet before the day's duties begin. Your bones protest softly as you sit up, shoulders uncoiling after hours of stillness. Your hand reaches for the worn leather strap beside the berth and draws it back to release the blankets. The air is cool to the skin, touched with the brine of night fog that seeps between shuttered windows. You pause there, feet dangling over the edge of the narrow cot, and listen. The tower creaks ever so slightly as it settles. The stone stairwell murmurs with unseen drafts, and far below you can still hear the muted hiss of surf against the base of the tower. It is solitude, but it is never quite empty. Swinging your legs onto the floor, you stand barefoot for a moment, feeling the chill of the wooden planks through the sole of each foot. Then, with a careful lift, you slip into heavy-soled boots and guide your feet toward the door. The soft thud of leather on aged floorboards echoes in the darkness, a slow, deliberate drumbeat that you alone conduct. Each step brings you closer to the storeroom, each footfall stirring a faint perfume of tar, oil, and salt that lingers in the corners. This ritual crossing of threshold marks the first stirrings of the day, your own small invocation to keep the lamp alive. Reaching the small table by the door, you extend a hand toward the pewter candlestick where last night's rushlight has guttered to a stub. With a practiced flick, you strike a small piece of flint against steel, coaxing a glow that licks the wick. The rushlight flares, trembling for a heartbeat, then steadies into a pale golden flame. Its light spills across rough walls and the chipped wood of the doorframe, revealing faint scrawls of chalk where you once jotted reminders and measurements. In this subdued radiance, each tool and timber beam seems to hold its own quiet history. Guided by the modest rushlight, you hurry down the hallway in measured steps, pausing only to secure the lantern room door behind you. The corridor tilts ever so slightly toward the west, an angle worn smooth by decades of footfall. At the far end, the oil storeroom awaits, a low-ceilinged space lined with sturdy shelves supporting rows of metal canisters and glass flasks. The faint scent of whale oil hangs in the air, rich and a little cloying, mingled with the earthy tang of damp stone. You set the rushlight upon a shelf, careful that the flame cannot stray to anything combustible. You stand for a moment in half-light, hands at your sides, mind drifting to the quiet roar of the sea below. Far off, you can discern that familiar murmur, wave upon wave tumbling in toward the reef-strewn coast. It is a sound that has accompanied your every waking minute and every slumbering hour since you first took watch here. Today it speaks of calm waters and a cloudless horizon, yet you know too well how swiftly the sea can transform. For now, this gentle susurration is a benediction, a reminder of why the lamp must shine, to guide mariners safely past these unforgiving rocks. Clearing your thoughts, you lift a lantern canister from the lower shelf and settle it on a stout wooden crate. The metal feels cool beneath your fingers, its surface marked by fingerprints and tiny dents that tell tales of hurried repairs and midnight crises. You uncork the vessel and inhale, noting the mellow sweetness of filtered oil. In the faint flicker of the rushlight, you can see motes drifting in the air, each a tiny ship trudging against an unseen current. Taking a rag from your belt, you wipe the canister's rim and prepare to pour its contents into a measuring flask for transport to the lantern gallery above. Before you overturn the spout, you pause to glance beyond the tiny window set high in the wall. A sliver of horizon, gray and diffuse, hints that dawn will grace the skies within the hour. Already, stray strands of mist rise from the sea and creep across the rocks. One day you might tire of the endless repetition, but this hour of liminal light, when the world seems paused between night's end and day's birth, remains a secret delight. You bow your head in quiet gratitude, thinking how this routine both demands and rewards an unhurried spirit. Carefully you lift the oiled flask to shoulder height, mindful of every drop. The solvent-smooth liquid flows with a soft gurgle into your supply bottle, filling it until the brass tank gleams with promise. Any spill could dull the flame later, so you wipe each stray bead away with the linen rag. The room smells of oil and stone and something ancient, time itself distilled into tangible form. You cap the flask, stow your tools in the small sling tied at your waist, and extinguish the rushlight against the iron snuffer. Darkness swallows the storeroom once more. Back at the head of the stair, you pause before descending. In your hand you carry the flask and a trimmed wick, both essential for ensuring the light will not falter. At the lip of the staircase, you shut your eyes to listen. The ocean's pulse, the sigh of wind through a half-open trapdoor, the unseen footfalls of gulls skidding offshore. Then you open the logbook, a thick volume bound in oiled leather, and find the most recent entry. Its pages are carefully lined with ink, each entry recorded in neat, looping script. Tonight, you will add a new line beside the date. With quill in hand, you steady the book upon the crude writing desk nestled beside the stairs. The candlelight from the lamps below seeps upward through the gallery grates, suffusing the chamber with a trembling amber glow. You dip the quill into the inkwell and pause to consider your words. The hour, 3:30. Sea conditions, calm swell with moderate wind from the northeast. Sky, heavy clouds receding in the east. A faint promise of dawn. You inscribe each observation methodically, mindful that future keepers will rely on this record as faithfully as you rely on their marks. Pen poised, you linger on the pause between entries, letting your thoughts drift to the day ahead. Soon you will climb the spiral stairs with oil and lamp parts, oil the mechanism, polish the brass, and record the sun-dappled patterns on the sea. But for now, you simply breathe the quiet, feeling the gentle promise of duty unfolding in the hush of pre-dawn. Outside, the waves continue their timeless refrain, and within you, a small flame of purpose stirs to life, ready to meet whatever the day may bring. By the soft insistence of a single guttering wick, the keeper begins his second task of the pre-dawn watch. The small chamber where he works is scarcely larger than a closet, its low ceiling hewn of rough timbers darkened by decades of candle smoke. A solitary candle stands in a simple iron holder upon the narrow pine table, its thin flame trembling as though reluctant to face the silence. Beyond the shuttered window, the sea presses close to the tower's stone base. The faint sigh of waves against hidden rock filters through tiny cracks in the wall. Inside, the air is still, scented with the acrid tang of old oil and the faint mustiness of sea spray long settled into the grain of the wood. His lantern now extinguished, he leans forward, cupping one hand above the candle to steady the light. The keeper's face emerges from the gloom in sepia tones, a swept forehead showing traces of last night's salt wind, a firm line of jaw set in concentration. Before him lie the charts he consulted in darkness hours before, a tide table folded into neat thirds, inked with the arrival time of high water, next to a broad map of the nearby coastline, its fine etchings nearly erased at the edges by constant handling. The fickle candle flame sends dancing shadows across these curves and lines, so that the map seems alive, the cliffs and inlets breathing, shifting as if about to return to the ocean's embrace. He reaches for a stub of charcoal and traces lightly alongside the printed tide curves, reminding himself which hour will bring the strongest current around the western promontory. The stick scrapes in measured strokes, each marking deliberate, assured. For hours until high water, 6 until the ebb that might carry unwary fishing boats perilously close to the shoals. Next to the tide table, a small pocket notebook lies open. With his quill he notes the clarity of last night's sky. Stars unclouded, wind westerly, sea calm, so that the log may serve the mariners who follow, or his own memory of this lonely vigil. Once the record is completed, he straightens, retrieves a pair of small shears from a shallow wooden tray, and turns his attention to the principal lens's wick. A narrow ebony box holds several dozen lengths of cotton cord, each carefully carded to draw oil into flame just so. The keeper selects one and holds it under the candlelight, measuring its length against a tiny brass gauge. 20 inches is the mark he favors for the coming hours. Too long, and the flame licks at the glass, leaving soot, too short, and the light will dwindle prematurely, failing its duty when mariners need it most. With a practiced hand, he trims the fringed end at a precise angle, spinning the wick between forefinger and thumb until it is smooth, tapering to its tip. Shadows flicker over the worn surface of the table as he sets aside the shears and reaches for the leather-covered volume of nightly observations. There, among neat columns of dates and times, he records the newly trimmed wick length and a brief note of its readiness. Wick set 22 inches, end cut 30 degrees, smooth wedge, no fraying. He closes the book and lays it aside with the care one might reserve for a prayer book, acknowledging its silent witness to each hour of tireless attention. The next task awaits, measuring out the day's supply of whale oil, the lifeblood of the lamp that stands atop the tower to guard unwary vessels. The keeper stands and crosses the low stone floor to a narrow wooden shelf inset into the wall. There, heavy flanged flasks rest side by side, still damp with the condensation of the previous night's chill. He withdraws one, the brass stopper cold against his palm, and uncorks it with a gentle twist. A thin ribbon of oil slips from the mouth, translucent gold like that held in the cup of sunrise, its surface aglow even here in the candle's shadow. Beside the flask he places a small pewter measure engraved with careful graduations. Half a pint, a full pint, and beyond. He tilts the flask, watching the oil rise in the measure's bowl. A muffled drip speaks softly as the keeper pours with unhurried precision, the liquid's weight settling in the pewter before he brings the measure back to the table. There, on a sheet of brown paper, he pours the oil again, this time coaxing every last drop into a glass reservoir specially fashioned to sit beneath the lamp's burner. He catches stray droplets with a scrap of linen. Nothing is wasted in this solitary outpost, and then seals the pewter cup, wiping it clean. In the candle's glow, the amber oil gleams in the glass like captured sunlight. The keeper places the filled reservoir into a stout wooden box with carved compartments, each labeled for the hour it must serve, so that through the night no more than one portion goes alight at any moment. A slow satisfaction warms him. His measured labors will ensure that as darkness deepens, the light above will abide, steadfast against the infinite black. Finally, before he extinguishes the candle and ascends to the lantern room, he opens his notebook once more. A brief notation is added. 0100 hours, dim glow noted approximately 2 miles to the southeast. Possible fishing vessel, sea calm, sky clear. Will monitor. His hand moves slowly across the page, the ink drying beneath the wavering flame. He pauses, tapering his pen to a point, lifting his eyes through the window's small aperture to the sea that lies just beyond. Though no lamp should challenge his own beacon, the faint tremor of light far off brings to mind the fragile courage of souls who wrestle the sea's uncertainties each night. He sets the pen down, tilts his head in a moment's reflection, then closes the notebook and places it upon the shelf. The candle's soft hiss is all that fills the hush now. He lifts the iron candlestick from the table and guides it carefully across the floorboards toward the stairwell door. Each step creaks beneath his boot, and the shadows dance one last time across the maps and charts before the candlelight vanishes as he slips into the narrow passage. In that dim corridor, he pauses once more, leaning his hand upon the cool stone wall. The hush reigns, broken only by a distant murmur of the surf. He breathes deeply, tasting the faint, lingering scent of oil and salt on the air. It is to this silence, and to the solitary flame he has prepared, that the safety of passing ships is entrusted. With a final glance at the darkened chamber behind him, he begins the climb, candle held aloft, each measured step bringing the oil and wick he has so carefully readied one rung nearer the lantern room at the tower's apex. There, by that single trembling flame, he will kindle the great light once more, banishing the shadows and guiding mariners through the vast and merciless black. The lantern room's single candle guttered low as Thomas lifted the tiny iron key from its nail by the storeroom door. A last saucer of molten wax dripped onto the table beside him, glinting in the wavering light before cooling to a brittle bead. He inhaled the familiar tang of tallow and whale oil, letting the memory of endless nights spent tending the solitary flame rise in his chest. Outside, the wind drifted in through a narrow slit of window, carrying with it the hushed roar of restless surf and a faint scent of brine. Within the storeroom, however, all was warm and quiet, punctuated only by the soft click of locked tumblers and the muted scritch of wood upon stone as the heavy door swung inward. The storeroom lay in half darkness, its battered pine shelves and stout wooden crates bathed in the ruddy glow of the candle. Against one wall stood barrel upon barrel of raw oil, each blackened by years of drip and spill, their staves swollen and cracked by damp. Along the opposite side crouched rows of gleaming brass canisters, small, narrow-necked vessels crafted for precisely the task Thomas now confronted. Beyond them, empty flasks of clear glass waited, fragile sentinels on a shelf, eager to be filled and dispatched to other corners of the tower. He stepped inside, closing the door so gently that the click of the latch seemed an intruder upon the hush, then set to drawing more light with a fresh rushlight from a cluster bound with twine on the wall beside him. He struck the rushlight's brittle tip against the flint, and tinder assembled in his palm. A shy glow blossomed and perched atop its reed-like wick, quivering in a breath of air before steadying to a pale flame. Settling the rushlight into its iron holder, Thomas looked about the storeroom with the methodical calm of a man who has performed this same ritual almost daily for years. His lantern lay to one side, unlit now, its globe rinsed clean just the evening before. The main task of this hour was to ready the reserve oil supply for the coming night's vigil, a procedure as unexciting in description as it was critical in practice. For in these lonely hours upon the cliff, no detail could be neglected. Even the faintest slip of neglect might snuff out the beacon and leave mariners to wander toward cruel rocks and hidden shoals. He retrieved a square of coarse linen cloth, its threads loose and softened by repeated washings, and tucked it under his arm. Carefully unstoppering one of the brass canisters, he set it upon the plank floor by the door. The weight in his palm spoke of solid craftsmanship, a vessel of polished metal that had weathered storms and salt spray without a single tarnished spot to betray its vigil. He placed the canister beneath a stout funnel carved of wood and bound with leather, then draped the linen cloth over the globed opening. The folds of the rag formed a crude but serviceable strainer, catching flakes of residue or stray flakes of charred wick that might otherwise drift into the heart of the lamp. With deliberate slowness, Thomas lifted the heavy oaken lid from a nearby barrel marked whale oil, Greta in small, precise letters. He drilled 4 small screw grips around the cask's lid to ensure a snug seal against the damp. The moment he pried it free, a thin stream of golden liquid sloshed against the cask staves, glinting like amber in the rushlight's glow. He paused, fingering the gap between barrel and lid, his lips nearly brushing the surface of the oil as though to inhale its faintly sweet scent. Then, with the attention of a watchmaker and the reverence of a monk, he tilted the barrel until the fluid edge crept to meet the funnel. There came the softest of sounds, a gentle gurgle and sigh, as though the oil itself were breathing a contented breath. The fluid shivered in the funnel's conical form, and then passed through the cloth in a slow, steady thread, trickling into the waiting canister below. Muslin threadbare in places, the linen caught its burdens with uncomplaining stoicism. Thomas listened to the hiss of oil upon metal, counting the second hand of his mind's chronometer, ensuring that each vessel received precisely the volume prescribed by the keeper's handbook. He had oversaw more than 1,000 such transfers. Each carried the same fragile balance between waste and want. One drop too many spilled upon the floor might stain the wood forever, while one drop too few might dim the lantern's glow when it was needed most. The gurgle grew softer as the level in the barrel fell, and Thomas tipped it with infinitesimal adjustments, coaxing the last of the oil against the sieve of cloth. Occasionally, a delayed drip would tumble to the floor, its plop against wood as light as rain upon glass. When he judged the canister full to the precise fill mark engraved around its neck, he halted. The cloth, heavy now and streaked with oil, sagged against the funnel, its color darkened by countless previous services. He lifted it away with one gloved hand and set it aside, then took a handful of the old linen rag. He chose this particular strip because it bore no holes from moths nor fraying from too many scrubbings, and pressed it firmly against the canister's rim, clearing every last sign of spillage. A quiet ritual of wiping followed. He turned the brass vessel in his palms, its curved surfaces catching the candlelight in tremulous gleams, while he busily banished any sheen of grease. His open shirt sleeve brushed the dusty floorboards, and he paused to brush a hair of linen from his cheek. Through the shoebox window he glimpsed a slip of cloud crossing the moon's face, but here inside, the world narrowed to his hands, the soft drip of oil, the flicker of a lone flame. Once satisfied that the canister shone as though new, every fingerprint, every smear dissipated, he replaced its cap with a gentle click. The threads of the closure were precise, and he turned them until the brass seal lay flush against the rim, the canister now impervious to air or clank of rough handling. He repeated the process twice more, drawing fresh oil into two smaller flasks destined for emergencies and quick replenishments. Each flask received its linen strainer and ritual counting of heartbeats, each cloth removed and cleaned by the same steady hand. When the final vessel lay primed and waiting, Thomas gathered the empty staves and the drip of funnel and returned them to their places on the shelf. He wiped the floorboards free of stray droplets, pausing at each smear to coax it into invisibility with a scrap of rag. The boards, scarred by years of footfalls, stained by years of oil, were a ledger themselves, and he treated them with courtesy, mindful of every scratch and nick. At last he set the fresh canisters in a neat row on the storeroom's highest shelf, side by side like patient sentries. Their polished bodies framed in the dancing candlelight, they promised an unbroken yet supple supply for the lamp above. Thomas traced his finger along each inscription, small numbers marking date and year of last refill, feeling the smooth brass cool beneath his touch. He straightened then, brushing his coat with the back of his gloved hand, and took a moment to drink in the hush around him. No ship's horn intruded, no wolf whistle of wind battered the walls. Here, for a breath of time, the world seemed to hold its breath in shared vigil. Extinguishing the rushlight, Thomas wrapped its stub in a scrap of paper and tucked it into his tunic pocket. A final glance about the storeroom confirmed every tool replaced. No stray rag, no unlatched canister remained to mar the order he always sought to preserve. He opened the door, letting the echo of hinges announce his departure, and paused at the threshold. Ahead rose the curved stair of stone, its steps worn smooth by decades of solitary climbs. Now, with the lamp's reserve filled and sealed, he would ascend to the lantern gallery above, where the dawn would soon arrive to meet his prepared flame. He inhaled the sharp tang of sea air mingled with oil, squared his shoulders, and stepped out into the dim corridor, the soft click of brass echoing behind him like a promise kept. He pauses a moment in the oil storeroom's shadowed threshold, letting the last faint echo of his boot heels fade before stepping onto the first stone stair. In the dim half-light of dawn, he can barely distinguish one tread from the next, yet each step carries the familiar imprint of countless passages. His fingers brush the roughened edge of the wall, the granite cool and ever so slightly damp. The faint tang of whale oil lingers in his nostrils, mingling with the salt-nipped breath of the sea that drifts upward through narrow vents. Beneath the weight of tools and spares cradled against his chest, his shoulder muscles shift with practiced precision. He lifts his foot onto the first worn indentation, a shallow hollow carved by years of hurried climbs in storm and calm alike. 11 before him and 20 more to go, he knows, though the spiral seems to promise neither beginning nor end. Behind him rests the storeroom crate, nearly empty at last, and the silver canister filled with filtered oil is snug against his side. In the darkness, he balances by feel alone, fingertips grazing the uneven handrail, knuckles bearing the faint sheen of grease that once oozed from an overfilled flask. Each tread is polished smooth at the very center by the soles of over a century's worth of boots, the stone curving ever so slightly inward where thousands of scrubbing motions have worn it away. He climbs deliberately, breathing in measured inhalations. The spiral confines him. The tower's circular embrace muffles the wind's sigh and the sea's distant roar, yet those sounds still find their way in, softly, as if remembering what it was to be free of rock and mortar. A drip, somewhere above, plinks against the worn stairs, a metronome marking time. He pauses on the 7th step and leans his back against the wall. The granite feels like the backbone of an ancient creature, solid and unyielding. He closes his eyes for a moment, hearing only his own heartbeat and the faint rattle of the canister's cap as it settles. A crease forms between his brows, the only sign that the climb, though familiar, demands his full attention. The lantern slung at his hip swings lightly, nudging the stone with a hushed thud. He checks its latch by touch, and hears the soft click reassuring him that the glass remains unbroken. In the hush, every sound is magnified, the soft rustle of his woolen coat as he shifts his weight, the slight rasp of his gloves against the iron railing. He inhales the mingled scent of damp stone, dry hemp rope from the coils at his belt, and that ever-present acrid hint of oil, the very substance he tends as though it were liquid gold. Around him, the spiral swoops upward in endless geometry, each stair curving into a farther horizon only to return again underfoot. With steady resolve he pushes off the wall, erecting his posture for the remaining ascent. The steps grow scant and narrow as he nears the top, worn to a more pronounced slope by repeated use. Here, the keeper must lean forward slightly, chest nearer to the wall, lest he lose balance in the tight turn. He slides his hand along the railing, noticing for the first time in days a slender crack in the wood, likely a fault that formed beneath the pressure of too many days and nights carrying heavy burdens. He makes a mental note to apply fresh oil to the railing once his tasks are complete, sealing the grain against moisture and ensuring a smoother passage for his gloved fingers. Higher still, the smell of sea salt grows stronger. A faint breeze squeezes through the tiny openings at the seam of the trap door above, carrying briny tang and a whisper of kelp. He feels the change in air pressure, a subtle lift that hints at the wider expanse beyond this slender shaft. The echo of dripping moisture gives way to the soft scrape of granite, and he senses that the floor beneath his boots has shifted from molded unevenness to a rougher plane. One final curve of the rail, and the ladder rungs appear before him. Iron bars embedded in the rock, upwards into a square aperture crowned by a trap door. He moves more slowly now, careful not to jostle the precious load of tools, cloths, lens brushes, and glass panes balanced against his hip. The lantern, extinguished for the climb, waits in his pack. He will carry it last, to keep the path clear. First, he lays the oil canister gently against the ridge where staircase meets ladder, then sets down the brass wrench and a folded cloth wrapped around a spare wick. By touch alone he positions each item, so that none will slip as he mounts the iron rungs two at a time, hands gripping the cold metal until slight lines of moisture appear on his palms. Though the ladder is steep and narrow, he ascends with assured precision. A muffled exhale escapes him as his chest breaches the threshold into the lantern room. At the first glance of the chamber, he stands motionless. Gray morning light filters through the layers of glass panes, barely illuminating the rich brass framework of the lens assembly. Frosty dew beads along the edges of the lens, silent jewels waiting for the keeper's ministrations. For a moment, the world on the other side seems paused in stillness. The pitted balcony floor is slick with moisture, and outside, a drifting mist conceals the jagged rocks below in a gauzy shroud. He inclines his head to one side, inhaling the fresh, salt-warmed air that sweeps in through the open trap door. Around him, the vast lantern room bears the tools of his vocation in silent readiness. Oil reservoirs poised beneath brass spouts, stacks of spare glass panels, felt pads to cushion delicate surfaces. On the narrow walkway that crowns the tower, iron railings spiral outward like the spokes of a wheel, each picket flecked with rust and spray. Beyond the rail, the sea peeks through the haze in shifting patterns of gray and silver. He turns back at last to his cargo. Kneeling on the damp floor, he arranges each instrument in a loose semicircle. The funnel-shaped glass brush, the tin of fine chalk powder, the modest oil lamp used for close work, and the small knife for trimming the wick. Each tool appears familiar in the pale light, worn but faithful. He removes his gloves to inspect the brass cap of the canister, twisting it free and setting it aside. The filtered oil glints golden as it sloshes softly against the inner wall. In the hush of early morning, he uncorks the lamp and with delicate precision lights the tiny flame. It casts a warm glow that spreads tentatively across the lens tiers, revealing the delicate prisms and reflectors that transform mere oil into a guiding beacon for mariners. He lets the lamp rest on the cool stone sill and, standing, gazes through one of the crystal-clear panes at the mist-shrouded horizon. A single gull's cry carries across the water, and the sea's gentle swell creates a rhythmic motion, as though the tower itself were swaying softly on the waves. The keeper closes his eyes for an instant, feeling gratitude for the steady light soon to be rekindled, a guardian against darkness and storms. When he opens them again, he is ready to begin the careful work of polishing and inspecting, knowing that every measured step he took on the spiral stair led him here, to this threshold between earth and sky, solitude and service. In the widening dawn, he straightens his shoulders and reaches for the lens cloth. Beyond the glass, the morning mist will recede, but his vigil has just begun. The spiral stair lies behind him now, its worn steps bearing silent witness to every ascent and descent he has ever made. Ahead, the broad sea awaits, and with the new day's light, a fresh chapter of duties unfurls, guided by the steady beam that he is about to restore. A pale gray hush lay upon the balcony of the lantern room, where the keeper stepped out into brittle air still clinging to night's damp embrace. Below him, the sea stretched in mottled sheets of mist, the vapor rising from cold water like ghostly coils drifting free of any mortal shape. He paused, his palms resting lightly on the wrought iron railing, and drew a slow breath of salt and moisture, letting the dampness press cool against his lungs. The lantern behind him stood dark now, its brass gleaming faintly in the dim dawn. He had secured its workings moments earlier, and for a few precious minutes he would simply stand and observe. Soft tendrils of fog curled about the great Fresnel lens, dappling its polished surface with dew. Tiny beads of moisture formed on the curved glass panes, purling and sliding slowly downward. In that stillness, each drop seemed to move in deliberate procession, tracing paths so minute that their motion felt measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. He watched, transfixed, as the vapor spooled around the lens housing, drifting on currents only the sea could command. The world around him was soundless, but for a faint susurrus. The distant tapping of waves on hidden rocks below, the low sigh of wind coaxing mist from the water's surface. Drawing himself back from reverie, the keeper reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a single scrap of parchment, folded thin and dog-eared from many mornings of the same ritual. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the air. The scrap caught a breeze and fluttered upward, turning and twisting like a small bird in flight before drifting beyond the balcony's edge. He followed its arc with narrowed eyes, noting how the wind caught it at a precise angle, then how the paper finally uncurled and settled on the swirling air. A quick glance at the prevailing current, and he recorded in his mind, northeast by north, a light wind of perhaps 4 points. He returned inside and bent over his logbook, quill in hand. With deliberate strokes he inscribed, wind, NEBN light, mist rising. Visibility poor beyond 15 cables. Tide, ebbing low at 8:12. The letters stood neat upon the page, each word a small testament to his vigilance. When the entry was complete, he paused again to listen. Somewhere below, a lone gull cried, its note muffled by the fog but insistent nonetheless. It soared above unseen water, calling perhaps to a companion or merely certifying its own existence to the lingering dawn. Once more he ventured onto the gallery. The tower's stonework felt cold beneath his boots, and the iron bars along the edge glistened with moisture. He squinted through the haze, peering toward the shoreline and the rocks that jutted like broken teeth from the foam. At low tide, more of those outcrops would lie bare, but for now they hovered half-submerged, cloaked in swirling vapor. Their shapes emerged ghost-like, one broad and flat, as though nature had deliberately carved it into a natural platform, another narrow and spire-like, thrusting upward in defiance of the sea's ceaseless surge. He strained to distinguish details, leaning forward so that the mist-stung air rushed past his cheeks. Occasionally a fissure or ledge of pale granite would resolve itself in the gloom, then slip back into the gray swallow of fog as the currents shifted. Feeling the chill in his marrow, the keeper retreated once more to the small writing table set near the door. He laid fresh sheets of parchment upon the worn wood and uncapped his ink. The thin, crisp pages caught stray beads of moisture from his gloves. He patted them dry with the hem of his coat. Then, with a swift stroke, he began to sketch the coastline silhouette as it had presented itself moments before. A curved line indicated the gentle sweep of the bay. A broken series of jagged marks stood for the rocky outcrops. A few careful hatches at the horizon suggested the thinnest thread of open water beyond the mist. Even in half-light, he sought to capture the precise character of each crag and inlet, to preserve, on paper, the same quiet tension between sea and stone. While the ink set, he dipped his quill into water and tapped it lightly on the lip of his inkwell to remove excess. The tiny droplets scattered in the air like fine spray. In that spray, caught by the dawn's faintest glow, he saw a scatter of points almost luminescent against the gloom. A reminder that, though the day had not yet fully broken, the world was already shifting toward light. He reflected briefly on the nature of his vigil, how each morning he bore witness to things no one else might ever see, how the mist, though dreary to some, gave richness to his observations and anchored his purpose. He felt no impatience for clearer skies, no urging to peer beyond the limits of vision. Rather, he welcomed the slow unveiling of each detail, each subtle change in shade or outline. As the pale sky brightened imperceptibly, a distant sound reached him, the faint tolling of buoy bells moored beyond the reef. The notes were muffled by fog, but carried a resonant echo that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He listened until the sequence repeated, then made quick notation in his log. Bell buoy, heard 2 strokes, pause 3 strokes. Position approximate, SSE of tower by 2 cables. Every detail mattered. Each nuance of sound might guide a passing vessel or warn of hidden shoals lurking beneath the glassy surface. He replaced his quill and lined his sketch beside the day's wind record in a leather folder. The notebooks of previous keepers lay stacked behind him, volumes within which similar drawings and notations sprawled, each a testament to unbroken watchfulness through decades of dawns and dusks. He closed the folder gently, taking care not to disturb the fragile pages, and set it aside. Beyond the window, the fog had thinned just enough for him to make out a fringe of pale blue sky, a promise of clearer vision to come. Stepping back onto the balcony for a final survey, he felt the first keen edge of daylight sharpen the sea air. Patches of mist rolled back like curtains, revealing the muted green of kelp beds just beneath the surface. A solitary swallow skimmed across the inlet, its wings slicing through the veil before plunging into the haze on the opposite shore. He watched it go, a small flash of life in an otherwise spectral scene, and allowed himself a faint smile. In that moment, with damp stone underfoot and the world unfolding dawning light, the keeper understood anew why he undertook these quiet tasks each morning. He was at once observer and guardian, measuring wind and water, mapping coast and currents, translating unseen forces into records that might save some unwitting ship from wreck. So long as he remained at his post, the lighthouse would speak for itself, a sentinel of sound and silhouette, of mist and beam, commanding respect even when hidden behind the soft pageantry of dawn's earliest vapors. With that thought to steady him, he turned back toward the ladder leading down into the tower's heart, ready to begin the next sequence of his solitary routine. The mists would lift, the sun would climb, and soon the world would seem a different place. But for now, in this quiet interlude between sleeping night and waking day, the keeper lingered in the company of drifting fog and the silent measures of the sea. The lantern room lies shrouded in an eerie half-light as the keeper steps across the iron threshold, each footfall sending a faint tremor through the wrought iron gratings. Beyond the glass walls, the sea slumbers under a veil of mist, and only the hush of water against rock and the distant cry of a lone gull disturb the silent vigil. Here, amid the cool swirl of damp air and the faint scent of brine and machinery oil, the keeper begins his most meticulous work of the morning. The daily inspection of every moving part, every joint, every pane, that ensures the beacon shall never fail. He pauses beside the great rotation gear, its interlocking teeth faintly greased, but often tested by the relentless torque of wind and tide. With gloved fingers, he traces the circumference of the cogwheel, feeling for rough spots, any hint of abrasion that might herald grinding metal in the dark. He crouches, eyes narrowed, to observe the delicate play of light across the steel. Minute flecks of rust glimmer against the shining surface, evidence that, even here, the sea's salt-laden breath wages a quiet war on iron. From his belt hangs a small oiler, its slender spout bent at the perfect angle to deliver a steady bead of lubricant. He applies it sparingly, one drop at each bearing, then turns the gear by hand, listening to the soft hiss and the almost inaudible click of tooth against tooth. A few more revolutions, slow, deliberate, and the keeper judges the mechanism restored to smooth operation. The sound is subtle, but to his practiced ear it sings of readiness. He rises, straightening his woolen coat against a shiver that has nothing to do with cold. Moving to the trap door that leads to the spiraling stairs beneath, he rests his hand upon the iron ring set into the trap's edge. That ring, too, must swing freely, for in a storm it will be his only path downward. He grasps it, lifts the lid just enough to expose the hinge pins. A smear of dark oil along their length befriends the metal and steel. Without it, the pins would grind and seize. He retrieves his oiler once more, tilting the spout into a pin's small crevice until the metal begins to glisten anew. A gentle tug and release of the trap assures him that it will yield without a cry, even under the weight of boots laden with salt crust. Satisfied, he closes the lid with a muted thud and kneels to examine the shutters flanking each window. A hand, clad in worn leather, brushes across the rusted bolt securing one shutter board. He eases the bolt free, oils the slide, and lets the shutter swing open on its rejuvenated pivot before securing it once more against the stone wall. From here, he moves to the glass panes themselves. For enormous rectangles of thick plate glass hold at bay the cold wind and spray, bending the elements around the warm glow of the lamp yet to be lit. Sea spray, blown by every storm, has over time etched a network of hairline fractures in some panes. Cracks too fine to admit a draft but insidious in their slow spread. By lamplight each morning, he inspects every panel. He sets his palm flat upon its inner surface to check for vibrations, taps the edge with a small mallet to listen for hollow notes, and shines the lamp beneath him so that light catches flaws like ice veins. Where he finds a tiny fissure, no more than a spiderweb of lines, he circles it lightly with chalk to monitor its length until the next supply ship arrives with replacement glass. Today, all panes hold firm, and he wipes away the last traces of dew with a swatch of chamois leather folded thrice in his fist. Finally, he addresses the lamp supports themselves, stout brackets of brass and steel that hold aloft the great oil reservoir and the concentric rings of the Fresnel lens. Between each curve of metal and every thread of pipe, tiny nuts fasten one segment to another. Over the hours, vibration from the gear and subtle shifts in temperature can slacken these fittings, threatening to throw the lamp out of alignment. He grips a brass wrench, its jaws polished by countless turns, and sets it upon the first nut. With deliberate pressure, he tightens until he feels the gentle resistance of metal mated perfectly. He works his way around the circumference, tightening each fastener in sequence. As he turns, his thoughts drift to the night spent here, standing vigil alone, to the mountainous waves that would engulf the horizon and the skiffs that would seek safe passage by his guiding light. Each nut turned is a promise, that the beacon will stand against the tempest, that a lone clutch of sailors far at sea may glimpse its steady flash and believe in their deliverance. The ritual complete, he steps back and surveys the lantern room. The mechanism rests ready, the glass spotless, the shutters poised against wind, and the trapdoors free to swing. In the growing dawn, the keeper feels the warmth of accomplishment, as though the entire structure has exhaled in relief. He gathers his tools, oiler, wrench, mallet, and sets them in their wooden box by the door. The box itself is scarred and stained from years of use, its corners rounded by handling, its lid secured by a simple brass catch that still clicks crisply when released. This toolbox has accompanied him through every inspection, every squall, every hour of uneasy calm. He stands at last before the eastern window, watching as the first pale tendrils of daybreak slip over the restless sea. The lamp will not burn for many hours, but in his mind the mechanism already hums. The gear turns, the shutters wait, the glass gleams. He breathes deeply, inhaling faint scents of oil and salt, steel and stone. The world beyond slumbers, but here within the lantern room, his vigilance kindles a quiet flame of assurance. In a moment, he will descend to the storeroom to prepare breakfast, to stoke the stoves and fill his lungs with the promise of warm porridge. Yet in these few minutes, standing alone amid brass and glass and iron, the keeper savors the ordered peace born of his careful ministrations. Each morning he survives, each voyage that reaches safe harbor, owes something to these small acts of attention. A simple nut tightened, a hinge oiled, a pane examined, such is the quiet craft of safeguarding mariners on the brink of the unknown. Thus, the keeper lingers a moment longer, fingertips brushing the cold stone sill, heart steady as the lantern room itself. Beyond him, the wind gathers its breath for another day. He has done all that must be done to meet it. And when at last he turns and climbs down the spiral stair, the lighthouse will stand ready, its bones and gears in perfect cadence, awaiting the night when his hands will once again stoke its ever-watchful light. Before the wash of dawn reaches its full height, the lantern room lies still, hung between sea and sky as if held in suspension. A faint, preternatural hush fills the circular chamber, broken only by the distant susurration of waves and the muted creak of iron hinges. Here, where the great lens sits like a jewel upon its pivot, the keeper moves with deliberate care, gathering his tools for the morning's most exacting ritual, the polishing of brass framework and the cleaning of ceramic reflectors until they gleam in mutual devotion. He begins at the foot of the lantern, where 4 stout brass rings hold the immense Fresnel lens in precise alignment. In a shallow earthenware bowl, he has combined 2 heaped spoonfuls of coarse sea salt with a measured dash of white vinegar. The liquid fizzes faintly at the fringe where metal and acid meet, an alchemical whisper of reaction. Taking up a length of coarse cotton rag, he dips it into the mixture and wrings it until only a glimmer of brine remains. Then, with even strokes that trace the ring's circumference, he applies the paste, coaxing tarnish from the brass's weathered surface. Each pass of the cloth yields a whisper of friction, a barely audible sigh of metal against fabric. He works methodically, ring by ring, attending to every curvature and joint, pressing lightly only to unveil the metal's living warmth. Slowly, the dull bronze hue gives way to a pale, burnished gold, as if the rings themselves remember some inner brightness long concealed. When one band lies cleansed beneath the rising sun, he steps back to admire the pulley reflection before returning to the next, never hastening, never allowing distraction. Across the lantern room, the ceramic reflectors rest in orderly rows upon a wide wooden bench. Their concave surfaces, once veiled in a film of oil vapor and specks of dust, now await the keeper's gentle ministrations. He lifts the first bowl, its heavy porcelain cool against his gloved palm, and inspects it at arm's length. Faint blemishes mar the smooth hemisphere, tiny smudges of sooty residue, and the faintest fingerprint. With a slow exhalation, he sets the reflector upon a soft swatch of cotton and retrieves a second rag, dampened with a weaker solution of warm water and chalk powder. In this subdued white light, each circular mirror demands undivided attention. He wipes in concentric circles, never veering from the exact center, careful not to press too firmly lest he mar the glaze. With each revolution, the soiled matter dissolves, leaving behind an immaculate surface that seems to broaden the room itself. After the initial pass, he exchanges the rag for a tuft of dry flocking, buffing until the bowl's curvature vouches for its own purity. No streak, no speck, no sign of wear. Stacking the finished reflector on a soft fold of wool near the great central beam, he notes the way the earliest tracery of dawn light slides across its visor, refracted in a pale, spectral glimmer. One by one he completes the quartet of ceramic dishes, aligning them with mechanical precision so that their rims trace an invisible circle beneath the brass rings he has already polished. The geometry comforts him, the convergence of metal and ceramic, of warmth and chill, of refracted light and mirrored hope. Between these tasks he pauses to breathe, to press both hands atop the cool railing that encircles the lantern room. Outside, the sky is blushed to a tender rose at the horizon. The sea slopes away in gentle undulations, its surface still choked with slumbering mist. He listens to the murmur of breakers and watches the gulls wheeling in tepid currents of air. Inside, the lantern room seems a world apart, a sanctum of craft and care where every speck of dust might spell peril for the ships that navigate these treacherous coasts. Returning to the lens, the keeper lifts each ring once more with a practiced hand, sliding it back into its groove with a decisive click. He checks the metal supports for firmness, making sure that no bolt has loosened overnight. Then he inspects the ceramic bowls in their new positions, adjusting each until it sits precisely beneath the flange above it, ready to catch and project the flame's full force. The 4 bowls form quarter circles about the central lamp platform, each catching light and sending it outward in a perfect, measured sweep. For a moment he stands back, hands clasped behind him, and allows his gaze to roam over the assembled parts. The brass glows softly, as though lit from within, its polished facets beckoning memory of past storms weathered in vessels guided to safety. The white ceramic bowls hold the blush of dawn in their depths, as if they have absorbed sunlight even before the lamp is lit. In this stillness, the keeper feels the slow pulse of his own breath and the quiet authority that comes from mastery of such precise ritual. In his pocket lies the little silver key that will unlock the trap door to the stairs, but he does not hurry to descend. Instead, he reaches for a small brush and carefully removes the final specks of salt from the brass, mindful that no corrosive residue must remain. Then, with a clean cloth, he gives the metal one last rub, coaxing a mirror shine that mocks the pale morning light. Only when the brass is flawless does he allow himself to retreat. Securing the bowl of vinegar and salt mixture and the cleaning rags in a basket, he places them beside the workbench, ready for tomorrow's maintenance. He takes a final look at his handiwork. The lantern room feels reborn, a shrine of harmony between ceramic and metal, of science and art, prepared now to channel flame into a beacon. Each component lies in its appointed place, awaiting the evening's first spark. As the chill of dawn yields to the promise of colder air rising from the sea, the keeper turns his thoughts to the day ahead. From below come the first faint clatter of pots, signals that the stove is lit, that breakfast porridge will soon be stirred in its granite pot. The scent of scorched peat will mingle with the tang of salt, and he will descend the spiral stair to break his solitude with a simple meal. But for now, he lingers in the lantern room, letting the gentle quiet accompany the newly polished brass and ceramic reflectors, as though offering them a moment of commendation before the long watch resumes at dusk. This morning's labor has refined both tools and spirit. When next he ascends these steps, the sun will be well on its arc and the great lens will shine forth to guide distant mariners through changing tides. Yet in this hour, this liminal breathing space between night's end and the day's full rise, he stands a solitary guardian, content in the knowledge that metal and ceramic in perfect harmony can harness a single flame to pierce the vastness of sea and sky. The hearth lay cold at the far corner of the keeper's sitting room, its blackened cast-iron facade bearing the faintest scar of rust where sea-laden air had crept in through neglected seams. In the pale gray of early morning, The stove's flat surface gathered the faint glow of dawn filtering through a high, narrow window. The keeper paused at the threshold, boots silent on the worn flagstones, to inhale the mixture of salt mist from the sea and the lingering tang of oil from last night's work. The world beyond the thick walls remained indistinct, shadows of reef and swells painted in monochrome, while within, the promise of warmth and simple nourishment awaited. He knelt before the cast-iron stove, scraping ash from the firebox with a small steel tool. Soft, granular embers from yesterday's candlewick lay strewn about its hearth. Fetching a handful of dried twigs and one or two brittle spare kindling sticks, he stacked them inside with the precision of long practice, each piece crossing at gentle angles to encourage the draft. A small scrap of newspaper, its print smudged by damp, was tucked beneath the wood. Lighting a match, he watched the flame flutter to life, its orange tip curling toward the ceiling before diving into the paper's fibers. The tinder crackled softly, then caught fully. The kindling inhaled that first breath of heat, swelling into a tiny, disciplined blaze that creaked inside like a creature rousing from sleep. He allowed the fire a few moments to establish itself, then closed the stove's door, turning the vent lever to coax a steady flow of air. In the kettle perched above the burnished opening, water began its slow migration from cold clarity to tepid stirrings. While it heated, he retrieved from a battered wooden shelf the small, darkened pot reserved for morning porridge. The vessel's thin iron lip bore nicked marks from many years of stirring. A faint ring of hardened scum clung just below that lip, an echo of breakfasts past. Opening a canvas sack tied with twine, he scooped out a measure of thick, country-grown oats with the back of his hand. The grains, golden and rough, whispered against his skin as he dropped them into the pot. He measured solely by feel, 2 generous handfuls, sufficient to form a modest meal without waste. The sack was folded and stowed away, its contents waiting patiently for tomorrow. By then, the kettle on the stove hissed lightly, and he poured the water over the oats in 3 steady motions, each arc of liquid driving the grains into their new vessel. The surface steamed, clouding the chill in the room. He set the pot back upon the hearth, adjusting it so that it sat directly atop the hottest spot. Crisply salted air curled down from the open window, finding its way into the room and brushing the rising steam with icy fingers. He covered the pot with a modest lid, then retrieved a wooden spoon of carved walnut from a hook on the wall. The spoon's handle, smoothed nearly bare by the passage of countless palms, fit comfortably in his hand, as familiar as any tool in his workshop. Returning to the stove, he peered inside the firebox through a slender glass viewing window. The kindling had surrendered fully to flame, revealing a bed of glowing coals that radiated soft, rose-tinted heat. He nudged the vent to widen slightly, encouraging the coals to flourish without letting the blaze grow too fierce. The cabin brightened imperceptibly, coppery light dancing across the ceiling beams. The kettle's spout gurgled, and he poured its last heated water down the scuttle, extinguishing any remaining sparks before closing the drain with a steady hand. Turning back to the porridge, he lifted the lid to examine the oats, which by now had swollen and softened, releasing a faint, earthy aroma. He added a small pinch of salt, sea-harvested and coarse, sprinkled from a runcible spoon into the bubbling mixture. The grains gave one last hiccup of steam as the salt settled, then resumed their gentle boil. Atop the stove's iron top, a small pat of salted butter, wrapped in waxed paper, was placed deliberately at one side. The butter curved slowly into the heat, first softening, then melting into a molten pool of cream and gold. He watched the bubbles rise where would met fat, each minute twist of the butter unfolding into the oats in a silky ribbon. Sensing the porridge nearing perfection, he spent a moment at the window ledge, leaning his forearms against the cool stone. Outside, the sea lay mottled beneath low cloud, its surface flecked with tiny whitecaps as a slender breeze slid in from the north. A lone gull wheeled against the horizon, its cry muffled by distance. Below, a rocky outcrop emerged from the shallows like a sentinel, holding fast against the tide. He absently turned a small bowl in his hand, an unadorned earthenware dish, circular and shallow, glazed inside with a pale blue hue that reflected the morning sky. It had been a gift from his late predecessor, who insisted such simplicity fostered clarity of mind. When the porridge was ready, he lifted the pot from the fire, setting it on a trivet of wrought iron on the stone floor. He stirred thoroughly, ensuring that each grain was coated in buttery brine. Then, guiding the bowl beneath the spoon, he ladled in the steaming meal, filling it nearly to its rim. A faint wisp of steam escaped, carrying with it the tangled scents of grain, salt, and butter. In modest ceremony, He brushed down the inside lip of the pot with his finger before returning it to the hearth for a final warm-up, should he require more. Passing the bowl through the open window, he perched it gingerly on the ledge to cool. Beyond, the salt breeze played with a thin curl of steam, pulling it into little curls that danced away toward the chiming lighthouse lens above. He inhaled deeply, allowing his mind to empty of tasks and timetables. A single spoonful of porridge rested on the ledge's edge, its surface marred only by a slight indentation, a silent invitation to patience. Finally, he retrieved the bowl and carried it to a small, aged table positioned before another narrow window. He sat on a stool scraped down to the bare wood in one place, a testament to long seatings and long thoughts. Cupping the bowl between both hands, he drew the porridge to his lips. The warmth radiated through his palms, rising into his chest and soothing the chill that lingered from the night's watch. The first spoonful tasted of the sea and the land both. Smooth oats thickened by the butter, brightened by salt, and tempered by the steadiness of sea air. With each mouthful, he allowed his thoughts to drift. To the arc of lightning he had witnessed months ago, to the faint shimmer of a ship's lantern on the horizon, to the quiet comfort of this solitary breakfast. There was no hurry here, no call to reinspect or record. For a fleeting stretch of time, he existed solely in this room of stones and steel and grain. The wind outside whispered against the tower walls, and the porridge bowl grew lighter in his hands. When the last spoon had been taken, he wiped the rim of the bowl on his sleeve and rose. The pot was still warm on the hearth, the fire now a gentle glow. He refilled his mug from a pewter jug of fresh water and sipped before returning the bowl to the pot, stirring the remnants into a creamy residue to be consumed later. The bowl was washed with cold water in a metal basin, dried with a linen cloth, and set to the side, ready for the next dawn. Rising once more, he cast a final glance at the window view, the windswept sea, the distant swell, and allowed a small, satisfied nod to settle in his shoulders. Sustenance and solitude had done its work, renewing not only strength of body but calm of spirit. With stove still alight and porridge reserves tucked away, he turned toward the well-worn door leading back to the spiral stairs. Beyond awaited tasks of logs and lenses, of charts and lenses and seals. Yet in this warm room, over his modest, sea-kissed meal, he carried a quiet certainty that this solitude, this rhythm of sea and stone and daily bread, was its own kind of beacon, guiding him through each new day. The morning light filtered in through the narrow window panes as the keeper drew a low wooden table close to the sill. Each pane bore the fine web of salt spray etched across its surface, and through them the sea lay gray and gentle, the horizon barely distinguishable from the misted sky. He carried with him a rolled parchment of charts, tied with a length of coarse twine, and a small leather satchel containing ink, quills, a wax seal, and spare sheets of parchment. Setting the bundle upon the floor, he knelt and untied the cord, allowing the charts to unroll smoothly, their edges curling slightly from time and damp. The first map revealed the jagged outline of the coastline he knew so well. Each headland and bay was marked in fine script, the names of rocky coves and hidden shoals already familiar from years of study. He smoothed the paper with the palm of his hand, feeling its slight unevenness, a testament to its age and the careful hand that had drafted it. He moved to the satchel, drawing forth an oblong bottle of dark ink, its cork stopper recently dried in the window's warmth, and placed it beside the map. A quill, its shaft trimmed and honed, lay ready for use. By the light of the morning, he traced the curves of the tidal lines with slow, practiced care. Each curve represented an hour of rising or falling water, charted from the long-ago observations of predecessors. He dipped the quill into the ink, wiping excess upon the inside lip of the bottle, then hovered above the chart. Another gentle touch, and a new line joined the others, marking the ebb at 9:30 and the flow reaching its crest at 4:20. His hand moved with confident deliberation, each stroke a quiet echo of the soft hiss of waves in the night, each notation a dialogue between man and sea. He paused to examine the progress of the tide for the coming week. Vessel captains relied on these tables to guide them in safely threading the straits between submerged reefs. A few tide days ahead held little threat, but the days after promised spring tides, when the rise and fall would reach extremes beyond the usual. The keeper recalled a storm-tossed schooner caught in an unexpected low tide some years past. Its captain had signaled distress flags from the deck before the hull grounded on hidden ledges. The memory stirred in him a sense of duty sharpened by time's passage. His charts must be precise, his notes exact. With the tide curves complete, he reached for a separate logbook, its covers scuffed and the pages showing faint rings of previous ink. There he recorded his observations of weather, the barometer reading from before dawn, the whisper of wind shifting from northeast to east, and the faint glimmer of sunlight behind low clouds. He paused in his writing, listening to a sudden squall of wind through the open window, carrying the scent of cold salt and rain. The glass panes rattled faintly in their frames. He looked out and saw the sea's surface corrugated by the freshening breeze. Gulls wheeled against the pale sky, their cries muted by distance. Turning back to his charts, he took a fresh sheet and began sketching a simple line of airflow patterns, arrows indicating the progression of the brewing gale. On the margin, he jotted barometric pressure at regular intervals, 29.7 inches before the squall, now falling to 29.5 inches. The notes were careful, the script exact. Each letter stood apart, as though he were engraving it upon the page itself. He underlined the approaching wind shift twice, then circled the notation in red wax pellet to draw further attention. On a blank page, he mixed a small batch of sealing wax, warming it over the stove, then affixed a tiny globe of deep crimson upon the weather log at the point marking the gale's expected arrival. These details attended, he folded the tide charts neatly. The map's edges aligned with measured precision, each fold creased sharply, then smoothed under his palm. He tied them together with fresh twine, securing a small tag inscribed, "Spring Tides, Days 4 to 10." Beside them he placed the weather log, fastened by its seal, and stacked both upon a shelf reserved for reference, within easy reach, yet protected from damp. He arranged them alongside previous volumes, a silent archive of sea and sky. The keeper leaned back in his chair, the wooden slats creaking beneath him. He breathed deeply of the chill air, eyes drifting once more to the distant horizon. The charts lay silent, but within their curves and lines lived the promise of approaching swell and shift. He pondered the day ahead. Later he would descend to the storehouse to gather provisions, anticipating a day or two of bluster and spray. A handful of tea leaves and salted biscuits might keep him company should the gale compound into a storm. For a moment he closed his eyes, recalling the hush of a calm sea at dawn, the gentle lap of water against the rocky shore. Then, with a careful motion, he returned to the little stove in the corner. He filled the kettle with fresh water, its tin whistle ringing as it warmed over the burning coals. He set a small cup upon the table, steeping tea leaves that tinted the water a muted amber. While the liquid drew, he restored his writing implements to their leather pouch and checked the quill once more for stray barbs. Tea in hand, he stood at the window again, warming the porcelain cup between his palms. The tide charts, the weather logs, the sea and sky, they all came together in a measured dance of knowledge and observation. The keeper knew that the next hours would require vigilance, checking the trap doors on the gallery, inspecting the lens shutter for sea spray, ensuring the lamp remained at ready. But in this moment of calm, armed with ink and chart and stirring breeze, he felt the reassuring flow of history in his veins. He returned the empty cup to the table, listening to its faint clink against cloth. He reached once more for the charts, this time the smaller diagram of trading winds, drawn by earlier mariners who noted how the air itself carried vessels toward distant islands and ports. He compared the current circulation with those ancient annotations, marking a subtle shift in direction that might aid incoming ships or hinder their progress. Each arrow he added was a thread in a tapestry of tide and air, a record of nature's rhythm as it pulsed beyond the tower walls. By the time the kettle's steam had vanished and the small writing alcove quieted, the keeper had completed his tasks. The charts rested side by side, annotated and sealed, the tide curves drawn in sable ink, the weather warnings affixed in wax, the wind arrows tracing hope and caution. He closed the logbook with a soft sigh, its leather binding creaking like an old friend settling into place. With the morning's work finished, he stood, stretching shoulders stiff from bent posture. He glanced once more at the spread of sea beyond the window. The tide was turning now, the water inching silently toward its next crest. Above, clouds gathered in swirls, the wind tickling the tower's battlements. He took a final breath of the briny air, then set the logbook on its shelf and picked up the maps, tucking them beneath his arm. Stepping away from the table, he prepared to descend the spiral stair toward the storeroom. The charts and logs would guide his plans, additional supplies, stout tools, spare wicks and lamps. The day's next tasks awaited, but within the measured lines and careful notations lay the essence of his life here, the quiet communion with sea and sky that defined each passing hour. And so, with charts in hand and purpose in his step, he left the alcove, ready for the work that would follow, as the tide itself continued its permanent, unhurried dance. A gentle hush has settled over the tower as the keeper pauses in the mid-morning light, his breath measured and steady. He turns from the small desk where he logged the latest tide readings and unfurled the weather maps. Now, guided by a single beam of sun that filters through the shuttered window, he steps back into the narrow corridor. His boots, still damp from the sea mist clinging to the stairwell walls, make barely a sound as he moves toward the trapdoor that leads down to the storehouse. He pauses for a moment, placing his hand upon the cool iron latch. The metal is smooth beneath his fingers, worn by years of regular use. A faint echo of distant waves drifts up the stone walls, mingling with the hush of the lighthouse's heart. In one deft motion, he lifts the latch and the door swings inward, revealing a flight of steep, spiraling steps carved from dark granite. Each step is slick with a thin film of moisture, and he takes them slowly, as if honoring the countless keepers who trod this path before him. A single lantern sways at his side, thrown alight by a match he struck where the candle stub still smoldered in its tin lantern at the desk. The flame flickers, sending dancing shadows ahead of him on the rough stone. Below, the storehouse lies cloaked in shadow, shelves and crates stacked with the provisions he relies upon. He descends until he can feel the weight of the air change, cooler, stiller, and tinged with the faint, heavy scent of salted meat. At the foot of the stairs he straightens, adjusting the lantern so its glow falls upon rows of oaken shelves and weathered wooden crates. Overhead, a low ceiling of vaulted stone curves inward, and the walls are lined with iron hooks and nails where ropes and nets once hung. He steps softly across the earthen floor, careful not to disturb a piece of stray wood or the faint rattle of a loose board that might echo too loudly in this tomb-like space. First among his tasks is to gather the day's allotment of salted meat. He reaches for a pair of iron tongs hanging from a nail in the wall, tools he set in place last week when he cleaned and prepared this chamber. With the tongs he lifts the lid of the nearest crate. The scent of curing salt and old juniper berries drifts up in a gentle wave, carrying with it memories of storms weathered and meals eaten in solitude. Inside lie neat blocks of beef and pork, each wrapped in coarse linen bandages. He sets the crate aside and opens the next. The beef here is firmer still, marbled with fat that will yield flavor when the stew simmers slow over the cast iron stove in the keeper's living chamber. He counts carefully, 1, 2, 3 neatly packed barrels of salted meat, each weighing nearly 20 pounds. He records the number on a scrap of paper he carries in his pocket, noting the date beside it in case he must refer back when his supplies run low. Then he moves to the sacks of dried peas. These sit atop a low shelf, heavy and bulging, secured by lengths of twine that his own hands knotted a fortnight ago. He kneels and unties the first knot, the rough fibers giving way with a soft, lingering creak. Tilting the sack over a shallow wooden bowl, he pours a handful of the peas, examining them for signs of damp or insect damage. Each is firm and matte green, uniform in size and shape. He feels the firm resistance between thumb and forefinger as he presses on one, confirming its dryness. Satisfied, he returns the handful and ties the sack closed once more. Next come the candles. In a narrow alcove he finds a stack of tallow candles, pale and cylindrical, each roughly the thickness of his thumb. He selects a half dozen and lays them upon a length of coarse cloth, a measure against bumping and chipping during transit. With care, he folds the cloth around the candles, tucking the corners firmly, and ties the bundle with a length of twine. The cloth is scratchy against his skin, but its coarse weave will cushion the delicate wax and prevent breaks. Each candle will serve him through 2 nights of watch, perhaps 3 if he trims the wicks sparingly. He looks around, ensuring he has not overlooked the spare wicks. They hang in loops on a small pegboard beside the jam jar of matches. He counts out 10 extra lengths of braided cotton wick, each nearly a foot in length. These he bundles separately inside a smaller piece of linen, pressing the cloth into a loose cylinder and tying it with thin jute twine. This precaution will keep the wicks dry and protected from stray oil spills that often gather on the floor of the storehouse. Turning then to the barrels of flour and the sacks of oats, he notes their condition. They stand on a lower shelf, the oats in coarse, open-weave sacks and the flour in stout barrels sealed with wooden lids. He taps the top barrel lightly, listening for a hollow sound that would betray an intact seal. Satisfied, he sets one barrel aside to be taken up to the kitchen for tonight's porridge, and perhaps a simple flatbread to accompany his stew. Beyond the dry stores, he glances at the arrowroot tins and the half-dozen sealed jars of jam, blueberry and currant, that Mrs. Henshaw sent in the last supply sloop. They remain untouched, their bright labels peering back at him through the lamplight. He makes a mental note to open one when he returns, for a spoonful of sweet preserve tastes all the richer when the world outside these walls howls with wind and foam. Satisfied that he has collected sufficient provisions, he pauses by a narrow window slit high in the storehouse wall. Through its small pane he catches sight of the lighthouse's white exterior, slick with salt and rain. A ridge of black cloud drifts low over the sea, a telltale sign of change in the weather. He steps back, aware that these stores may be his only safeguard should the gale sweep in unexpectedly. He ties the bundle of candles to his belt and rests the barrel of flour on his shoulder. Behind him, the crates of salted meat and the heavy sacks of peas line up on the floor like sentries awaiting departure. Before he ascends the stairs, he secures the storehouse door with the iron bolt. He slides the heavy bar into its slot, then tests the door's solidity with a firm push. Satisfied, he returns the tongs to their peg and gives one final glance around the dim chamber. The lantern's glow picks out the rough grain of the wooden crates, the fine mesh of the cloths he used to wrap his rations, and the crinkled surface of the paper labels on each bundle. With measured steps, he climbs the narrow stair once more. Each footfall is deliberate, the weight of his supplies shifting comfortingly on his back and belt. The air grows warmer as he ascends, the stones less damp. Dimly he hears the muffled rush of waves and the sighing of wind through the slats above. At the top, he emerges into the brighter corridor once more, carrying the fruits of his careful stewardship. Back in the keeper's quarters, he sets the barrel of flour down first, then the crates of salted meat and sacks of peas in neat order against the far wall. He places the candle bundle carefully atop a small shelf beside his desk, the linen wrapping a soft promise of light for the uncertain hours ahead. He unwinds the burlap and linen wrappings, stacking each candle upright in a shallow wooden tray. Beside them he arranges the wicks in their small linen roll, ready for swift access when the hour of nightfall demands fresh flames. As he extinguishes the lantern and stows it on its hook, he feels the quiet satisfaction of a morning's task complete. The storehouse provisions stand ready, each bundle and barrel a testament to order and preparedness. Outside, the air carries a slight shift, a salt-tinged breeze that whispers against the window panes. Storm or calm, he is ready. He moves then to the low table beneath the window. From his pocket he retrieves the scrap of paper and pen, and in neat, precise handwriting he enters the day's ration count into the logbook. 3 barrels salted meat, 1 barrel flour, 6 candles, 10 wicks, 2 sacks dried peas. He dates the entry and closes the book with a soft thud. The soft ticking of the clock on the mantel marks the passage of time. The morning's work has given way to a stillness that feels almost sacred. He straightens the open shutters and lets in the full light of midday, ready now to reflect and record what will soon become Chapter 11, High Noon Reflections. The rations lie within arm's reach, a silent assurance that even if the winds turn fierce and the world beyond is lost to spray and storm, the keeper and his beacon shall stand firm together, fed and sustained until the next dawn arrives. The sudden flush of sunlight across the stone floors stirred him from the gentle torpor of mid-morning routines. With deliberate slowness he rose from the oaken chair, its worn armrests cold against his forearms, and stepped toward the well-crafted shutters that guarded the lantern room's modest chamber. His fingertips brushed the splintered wood before he unlatched the iron hinge, and with a soft groan the shutter swung inward, admitting a flood of golden light that pooled on the desk and warmed the hearth, worn tiles beneath his boots. Dust motes floated in the sudden brilliance, drifting lazily until they found rest upon chart and paper. Outside, the sea lay placid and glistening, the white wash of tiny breakers tracing a jeweled path to the rocky shore. He paused, pencil in hand, as the tidal lull lent itself to contemplation. The midday hour was his brief sanctuary from endless duties, a moment set aside for reflection and for the precise, patient recording of nature's every shift. He crossed to the wide, low desk by the window, where tide tables and weather charts lay fanned like ships on calm water. The faded pages bore the imprints of countless voyages across ink and time, each curve in the printed tide schedule painstakingly followed by the quill of his predecessors. Now it was his turn to continue the lineage of measurements, to carry on the unbroken sequence of observations no other soul could so faithfully render. With a measured breath, he dipped his quill into the small well of ink. The blackness of the liquid mirrored the fathoms he so closely studied. His handwriting, neat and unhurried, traced wind shifts upon the margin, north by east, 8 miles per hour, a faint breeze tugging at the fronds of seaweed anchored to the rocks below. He noted the barometer's gentle descent, yet no storm threatened. The silver needle lay close to its usual midday mark. The keeper's log, thick with salt and discipline, received these entries as solemn witness to the ceaseless dance of air and water. He lifted the small, brass-bound barometer from its hook and angled it toward the light. The glass dome captured a precise reflection of the sky above, and beneath it the mercury column shivered in silent reply to subtle changes in the atmosphere. For a moment, he watched the silvery thread hover before committing its final height to paper. Then he recorded the number, pausing to align his digits with the ruled lines of the logbook. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a task performed with exactitude, and his shoulders relaxed as he returned the instrument to its place. At the far corner of the desk lay a delicate remnant he had gathered 2 days prior, a small wildflower pressed between the rough, hewn pages of a chart of the coastline. Its petals were pale as driftwood, and the stem, once pliant, now lay brittle beneath the weight of the paper. He lifted the flower with reverent care, holding it against the sunlight. The thin veins shone greenish-brown, a fragile map of memory. He traced their pattern with the tip of his finger and felt, in that quiet moment, a distant echo of childhood wanderings among heath and hedgerow. Here, so far from home, the bloom became a talisman, a slender thread tying his solitude to the land he once knew. A faint murmur carried through the open shutter, an undulating susurrus of wings and cries. He leaned forward and recognized, beyond the shimmer of the water, a dash of white among the distant breakers, a lone gull drifting on an unseen thermal current. Its plaintive call punctuated the stillness. He closed his eyes, letting the cry linger, woven into the thrum of wind and sea. In that syllable of sound lay the essence of this place, remote, constant, ever poised between calm and storm. He reopened his eyes to the logbook, resumed his seat, and picked up a second sheet of paper. With fresh determination, he drew a small, careful sketch of the horizon, its slight curvature, the pattern of rocks at low tide, the channel's narrow passage where fishing vessels passed close in the early morning. The lines were simple but deliberate, a slender sliver of sun on the horizon, a solitary buoy marking danger beneath the waves. Such sketches would guide mariners in the hours before dawn, when charts lay cold and unreadable under dim lanterns. His hand moved steadily, each stroke born of observation and memory. Once done, he tucked the wildflower between the map pages, its flattened form bridging the printed coasts like an amulet. He closed the map and pressed it flat with both palms, careful not to displace the bloom or crease the chart. At his shoulder, the tall window framed a panorama of pale blue sky and sea that shimmered to the horizon. He drew in the faint scent of salt and algae, balanced on a breath that felt half prayer, half promise. Rising again, he crossed to a narrow shelf where slender tubes of spare quills rested beside a vial of concentrated lamp oil. He lifted one quill, its shaft smooth and evenly trimmed, and tapped it gently on the desk, testing its readiness. Then he returned the unused pens to their cradle. The old one, still stained with ink, remained clutched between his fingers. It would serve until its point grew too ragged, reminding him that every tool, like every day, reached a point of exhaustion and deserved replacement at its appointed hour. From a small wooden box on the shelf, he retrieved his midday ration of bread and cheese. Breaking off a crust, he ate in near silence, mindful of each chew and of the way light fell across the cheese, lending it a warm translucence. The simple fare, though unremarkable, nourished him with the same mindful attention he applied to his chores. Even sustenance, if taken with care, became an act of communion with this place and with the life he had chosen. A passing shadow ruffled his trousers, a swift movement at the open window. He glanced up to see a small cluster of terns wheeling overhead, searching for fish in the shallows. Their sleek bodies carved arcs against the sky, and as they dipped toward the water, faint splashes echoed like distant applause. He watched until the white shapes faded into the bright ether. At length he set aside the remnants of his meal, washed the small wooden plate and cup in a basin of cool water, and polished them with a scrap of linen rag until they shone dimly in the sun. The basin's rim, warmed by the day, seemed to sigh softly as he placed it back upon the shelf. The midday interlude, like all moments of repose, would soon give way to further tasks. The delicate purging of lens prisms, the tightening of panels on the lower steps, the lowering of supplies for afternoon work. But for now, a measured hush reigned between the celestial light and the dark stone walls. He stood still for a moment longer, arms folded, chin tilted slightly upward. Beneath the swell of midday warmth he felt a quiet contentment, a sense that each painstaking detail, each jot of wind shift, each pressed flower, each bite of bread, wove into an unspoken narrative. He was both sentinel and scribe, watching the ever-changing theater of sky and sea while recording its drama in the humble ledger of a lonely tower. And when that final gull's cry faded into the vaulted hush, he turned once more to the logbook, pen poised, prepared to meet the afternoon with the same patient devotion that had carried him through every hour since waking in the pre-dawn gloom. The lantern room lay hushed beneath the pallid glow of an overcast afternoon sky, its great Fresnel lens standing at the heart of the chamber like a solemn monument to careful craftsmanship. The keeper paused at the threshold, removing his soft-soled slippers to avoid scuffing the worn floorboards. A thin mist clung to the cool metal of the gallery rail, and in the stillness, he could hear each drop of condensation sliding down to join the quiet drip from a distant leak in the roof. Here, far above the restless sea, he carried forward one of the most exacting tasks of his solitary profession: the gentle cleansing of the lens, an art requiring time, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. He tipped a shallow basin beneath the panes to catch loose particles and set aside a collection of tools. A fine camel hair brush, a small pitcher of soft water mixed with a chalk-based cleaning solution, chamois leather folded into neat squares, and a folded cloth for drying. First, with careful strokes, he brushed away the coarse crystals of salt spray that had settled overnight. Each turn of the hand brought out minute grains that clung stubbornly to the delicate prisms. The keeper worked methodically, beginning at the highest segment of the inner lens ring and spiraling downward, as though he were following the unseen curl of light that would later sweep across storm-tossed waves. The camel hair brush whispered against polished glass, and in the still air, the faint scritch of bristles over scraped salt seemed amplified, like a whispered secret. He took a slow, steady breath, releasing tension in his shoulders. Although the ocean's murmur was inaccessible from this height, he could sense its presence through the weight of the air, the subtle shift in humidity, and the muted rumble of waves against distant shore. Even in this secluded alcove, the keeper's work remained inseparable from the sea. When the first pass was complete, he set aside the brush and reached for the chalk-infused solution. In a small dipper, the pale liquid glowed almost opalescent in the dim lantern light. With the chamois leather, dampened just enough to hold the solution without dripping, he applied a gentle polish to each pane. The chalk's fine particles acted as a mild abrasive, softening the last lingering streaks of residue. His hands moved with deliberate grace, an almost meditative choreography honed over years of nightly vigils. Dragging the leather cloth in smooth arcs, he watched as the surface transformed from dull frostback to crystalline clarity. At times he paused to inspect the work by holding a fresh piece of chamois up to the glass, checking for streaks, smears, or tiny spots that might distort the lamp's beam. Where a stubborn blemish refused to yield, he returned to it with fresh leather, repeating the motion until each facet appeared as clear as a drop of spring water. The keeper knew that even the smallest flaw, a stray hairline crack or a single mote of grit, could scatter the glow of the lamp, dulling its reach and imperiling mariners far below. Between stages, he set his tools carefully on the low wooden bench that ringed the room, wiping his fingers on a rag before picking up the next implement. A shaft of filtered light from a single porthole illuminated the work area, revealing the faintest halo of dust in the air. He leaned forward, breathing out, and allowed himself to remember the first time he had stood here, a green novice sent to guard the perilous coastline. The lens had seemed an inscrutable puzzle then, and now it was a trusted companion he tended with reverent devotion. Next, the keeper turned his attention to the brass framework that held the prisms in place. He ran a chamois-wrapped finger along the edges, ensuring no stray chalk remained on the mounting. A soft, almost inaudible squeak of metal on cloth accompanied each pass. He knew that the slightest abrasion, be it wood, metal, or glass, could compromise the intricate alignment of the panels. In the hush of the tower, every tiny sound felt magnified, as though the room itself acknowledged the solemn importance of his care. As he finished the final section of the outer lens ring, he set aside the chamois and took up a clean, dry cloth. With gentle, downward strokes, he removed any last trace of moisture, leaving the glass gleaming in the trapped daylight. The surfaces caught a whisper of diffuse light, refracting it into pale arcs that danced across the rough stone walls. The keeper paused to admire this quiet transformation, a humble chamber now ready to project a fierce beacon through the gathering dusk. Before closing, he performed the most exacting examination. He peered through each facet of the lens, segment by segment, scrutinizing the fine curvature of the prisms. He closed one eye, peering intently with the other, and traced his gaze across 16 precise rings of glass. Any wavering line or subtle distortion would reveal itself under his scrutiny, and he would not rest until every element passed his exacting standard. Occasionally, he discovered a tiny chip at the very edge of a pane, or a faint discoloration that spoke of years of exposure to wind and brine. In those moments, he made careful notes in the margin of his logbook, planning for a future repair when the light allowed a marine chandler to visit. The keeper lingered for a moment longer, hands folded behind his back, surveying the vast circle of glass that surrounded him. Beyond the lens, the sky had darkened to a brooding gray, and the first edge of approaching evening was already writing its shadows across the room. He set the basin and the scattered cloths aside, closing each porthole to shield the chamber from the coming gusts. Soon he would trim the lamp's wick and fill its reservoir with fresh oil. But for now, the lens stood immaculate, a silent promise that when night fell, its light would travel true and far, guiding any weary bark or merchant brig away from the jagged rocks below. In this moment of completion, the keeper allowed himself a thin smile. The act of lens cleaning, so solitary, so unhurried, was at once a practical task and a quiet ritual of service. Each clear pane stood between safety and disaster, and his patient work ensured that the line of light would never falter. He straightened, his back warmed by the memory of days' earlier chores, and gathered his tools with care. The chamber seemed to exhale as he moved, as though relieved to rest until his next inspection. Outside, the world carried on in its relentless tides and urgent winds, but here, high in the tower, time had paused for a brief interlude of perfection. With the lens cleansed and the brass gleaming softly in the low light, the keeper descended the narrow spiral stair, leaving behind the silent prism that awaited nightfall. Each footstep echoed with tranquil confidence, for he knew that when the lamp was lit once more, its beam would shine through glass unblemished, carrying hope to every mariner who ventured into the deepening gloom. In this quiet art of lens cleaning, he had found both purpose and peace, an act of vigilance that bound him, quietly yet irrevocably, to the rolling seas and the ships that sailed upon them. The afternoon sun had climbed high enough that the pale stone walls of the lighthouse warmed under its gaze, yet a cool breeze still carried the salt and spray of the ever-moving sea. After the delicate chore of lens cleaning, the keeper set aside his chamois and brushes, trading the precision of prisms for the dependable weight of tools he would need to preserve the tower's endurance against wind and water. He stepped from the lantern room onto the balcony, the planks beneath his boots faintly creaking, a reminder that even solid timbers yielded in time to the sea's relentless breath. First, he approached the massive oak door at the base of the tower. Its iron hinges and bolts had weathered many winters, and though they bore a patina of deep russet, each joint demanded attention. The keeper crouched to examine the lower bolt, running a gloved finger along its rough surface. With a small hammer and a stout punch, he tapped the catch free, then drew a slender iron key from his belt. He inserted it into the winding mechanism, turning carefully until he felt the tumblers inside shift into alignment. Once released, he slid the bolt back into place, then used an oily rag to coat its length, encouraging a smooth glide rather than a grating grind. A steady hand held the bolt as he tightened two adjacent nuts with a wrench of polished brass, the tool's familiar weight comforting in his grasp. Each twist brought a mild creak, but as the bolt knuckled snugly against its keeper plate, the sound quieted to a muted thud, a small victory over the toll taken by wind, rain, and salt. He rose and circled the doorframe, noting the small gaps where the timber had shrunk in the dryness of summer sun and expanded during damp spells. On either side, the doorposts bore hairline fissures, a subtle invitation for water to seep, freeze, and widen them in colder months. The keeper selected a block plane from his belt, its blade keen and set shallow for fine shavings, and began to shave away the raised edges of the doorframe. Soft curls of wood fell away, drifting to the floor like pale confetti. When the surface lay even, he inspected each seam, then retrieved a small coil of tarred rope from a nail. He pressed the strands firmly into the narrow joint between frame and wall, pressing them home with the rounded handle of his chisel. These braided fibers would swell under dampness, filling any remaining cracks and keeping moisture at bay. Beyond the door, the louvered vents that provided air to the storeroom and living quarters demanded their own attention. He knelt before the first vent, its slats arranged like horizontal blinds, each a potential gateway for wind or rain if left loose. Drawing his small spokeshave from the toolkit slung at his side, he rested its iron blade on the edge of a slat. A gentle pull peeled away just enough material to ensure the slat fit flush against its frame when closed. He repeated the motion on each slat in sequence, imparting a rhythm that echoed softly, plane, pivot, plane. With each pass, the wood's surface grew smoother, the edges more refined. The keeper paused occasionally to run a hand along the louvers, testing for looseness or play. When he found a slat that still wobbled, he adjusted the brass pin that held it in place, tightening the screw until the slat shifted only with deliberate effort. Once all vents lay true, he seized a small brush and dipped it into a pot of warmed pine tar. The viscous liquid clung to the bristles, its dark gloss shining in the light. Gently, he applied it to the edges of the vent frame and the seams between slat and mortise, the tar seeping into every joint and pore of the seasoned wood. Its scent rose sharply, an earthy mix of pitch and resin that mingled with the salt air to form a curious, bracing perfume. The tar would harden into a seamless seal, preventing water driven by wind and spray from infiltrating the interior spaces during storms. He straightened and wiped his brow with the forearm of his sleeve, surveying the small cluster of vents now rendered nearly impervious to the elements. The midday light caught on the fresh tar, illuminating the grain of the wood where it had been newly planed. Ahead lay a small trapdoor that led to the roof walkway, a narrow passage he had yet to examine. Ascending a short ladder, he pushed it open and stepped into the mild light, the sound of gulls and distant breakers filling his ears. Here, exposed to the full force of wind and salt, the handrails and planking often suffered quickest. He began at the far corner, testing each board with a heel, listening for the hollow echo that betrayed rot or looseness. In one spot a plank shifted beneath him, its support beam having drawn away from the main wall. He marked the board with a scrap of chalk, then descended to fetch a sledgehammer and a length of wrought iron strap. Returning with these in hand, he laid the strap across the underside of the offending plank and drove stout spikes through its holes until the metal hugged the wood tight. The sledgehammer's blows rang out clearly, their cadence measured. When the strap lay firm and the plank no longer moved, the keeper tapped the protruding nail heads flush, then coated each with tar to stifle rust. Satisfied, he climbed back to peer once more at the horizon, a thin line of cumulus clouds drifting above the restless tide. It occurred to him how every repair, no matter how small, formed part of a larger safeguard against the capricious sea. Setting aside his tools, he paused a final time at the doorway leading back into the tower. The iron bolts gleamed darkly, the woodwork around them smooth and sealed. In this careful maintenance, the keeper saw not only the labor of his hands, but the promise of continued safety for passing mariners. Behind these walls, amid the solitude, each tightened screw and tard seam proved itself a quiet bulwark against tempest and decay. Lowering his gaze, he noted a fresh scrap of paper pinned to the masthead, a memorandum reminding him to replenish the stock of lead washers before the next supply ship arrived. Tucking it into his coat pocket, the keeper turned inward, ready to resume his vigil indoors. The afternoon light softened, and in the chambers beyond awaited ledger and letter, pen and ink, where the next chapter of routine would unfold beneath the hush of the sea's steady murmur. A gentle hush settles in the lantern room as the keeper stirs the coals in the small hearth, coaxing a modest flame into life. Outside, the sea remains low and calm after dawn's gray retreat. Within, a stillness lingers, undisturbed but for the occasional hiss of the kettle and the soft creak of worn floorboards. This is the hour reserved for correspondence and accounts, when the day's disciplined labors yield to a quieter, inward rhythm. He fetches a simple tin kettle from its hook by the stove and pours water cold from the cistern into its belly. Setting it upon the heated coals, he draws a deep, steadying breath of the salt-tinged air and walks to the window to watch wisps of vapor rise from the water as it warms. At his small oaken desk, he arranges a tin basin of fine china teacups, a battered pewter teapot, and a porcelain saucer of tightly wound black tea leaves gilded with golden flecks. Against the wall, a shelf lined with leather-bound ledgers and small chests of sealing wax catches the early light. He removes a narrow stick of crimson wax from one of the chests, weighing it between thumb and forefinger, noting the tiny cracks that betray its age. With the tip of a small iron spatula, he shaves a thin curl of wax and places it upon the half-melted surface of a pewter spoon. Holding the spoon over the fire, he warms it until the wax liquefies in a tiny glowing pool. From a rack beside the desk, he retrieves a handful of letters delivered by the monthly supply cutter. Each bears the embossed crest of a distant post office in the south or north, stamped and sealed with care. The envelopes are thick, creamy parchment folded and creased where they have lain in transit. One is from his sister in Cornwall, asking after his health. Another, from a childhood friend now stationed on a merchant brig, offers tentative news of calmer waters beyond the channel. A third arrives heavily scented, its seal broached already. News from the lighthouse inspector's office, bearing instructions for the coming quarterly inventory. He pauses on each in turn, absorbing the weight of each message before breaking the seal. He begins with the letter from his sister. Gently, he presses the glowing drop of wax onto the envelope's flap and imprints it with the small signet ring he wears on his little finger, forging the bond of safety and attention a man of the sea must show his kin. With a soft crack, the seal adheres to parchment, promising that no eye untutored may glimpse its contents. Only then does he slip a thin-bladed letter opener along the fold, releasing a pale sheet of paper into his hand. His eyes follow the familiar, looping script, his sister's careful hand describing the small luxuries of home, the clatter of family hearths at winter's approach, the faint echo of church bells, and the promise of a supply schooner bearing seasonal Alesh by Christmas. He inhales the faint aroma of lavender pressed between the pages, memories of childhood summers trailing like gull calls across a quiet inlet. A fragile warmth kindles within him at her words, mingled with a quiet regret that he cannot return home yet another season. The next dispatch, marked official business, carries a more measured tone. He removes its red sealing wax much as he did the first, but this time he folds the strips of broken seals into a scrap and tucks them into an envelope for careful disposal later. The inspector's letter lays out a list of lamp filters, chains for the rotation gear, and a new supply of ivory wick trimmers to be delivered by the next coastwise steamer. He sets down the sheet, his pen rising on its feathered quill. With deliberate strokes, he records the requirements in the procurement ledger. Each item is noted by quantity and estimated date of needed replacement, the words neat and precise. He underlines rotation gear chain twice, recalling the friction he felt this very morning when testing the weight of the lantern door. A fine bead of oil glistens on his fingernail. He wipes it on his woolen sleeve and returns the letter to its envelope once more, sliding it then into a small chest labeled to dispatch. By now, the whistle of the kettle announces that the water has reached a boil. He pours slowly, sealing the spout's warmth in a thin ribbon of steam that curls upward like distant sea spray. He lifts the teapot by its handle and, with practiced care, fills the smallest of the china cups until its brim gleams. The first sip is brisk and astringent, stirring his senses after the dull focus of ledger and letter. He wipes the cup's rim on a linen napkin, then sets it on the desk beside the open account book. This ledger, its ivory pages speckled with ink drops and margin notes, is the heart of the keeper's domestic order. Here he tracks each barrel of oil drawn from the storeroom, every flannel jacket issued to visiting inspectors, the count of candles and matches consumed, even the price of a single sheet of letter parchment when mail arrives. He uncaps a bottle of India ink and dabs the quill, drawing ink slowly until the nib glistens. With deliberate pace, he enters a new line. 20 pounds of whale oil allocated to lantern service, September 14th. He notes the date and in a smaller hand beneath, balance in store, 115 pounds. The quill's nib emits a rhythmic scratch as he carries totals across columns, calculating with the same steady mind he uses to watch tides. As the candle on the desk flares in a slight breeze wafting from the open window, he pauses to draw his gaze outward. A solitary galleon drifts past the rocky skerries below, its white sails swollen with a gentle east wind. A lone gull circles overhead, tilting its wings in precise arcs. For a moment, his thoughts detach from ink and paper. He savors the hush between waves, recalling the solace that the routine provides. Then, with a final sip of tea, he returns to his papers. The last letter remains, a brief note scrawled by a mariner met months ago in Dover, asking for news of safe passages, and offering a token sum to be placed in his savings chest should an opportunity arise. He breaks the old seal and flattens the envelope beneath his palm, reading over the worn handwriting that has weathered many seas. Folding the sheet with the same meticulous care he applied to each chartered page, he tucks it into a private pouch bound by a faded ribbon, to be carried ashore at his next leave. Then he prepares the outward mail, 3 envelopes, each sealed and addressed with his neat script. One to his sister, one to the lighthouse inspector acknowledging supply requests, and one to the mariner in Dover, with quiet thanks and news of smooth waters. When the final seal is stamped, he stands and places the letters in a wicker basket by the door, where they will await the monthly cutter's arrival. The room falls into a gentle hush once more. The teapot is empty and cold, the inkwell capped, the ledgers closed. He steps to the window, leaning on the sill, and looks out over the sloping roof of the tower and the calm sea beyond. In this hush, he feels both the weight of solitude and the comforting order of his labors. The letters, ledgers, and lingering tea have tethered his thoughts to the wider world, and in so doing, reminded him that though he stands alone against the vastness of the ocean, he remains part of a greater network of lives, hopes, and histories unfolding beyond the lighthouse's beam. With a final exhale, he turns toward the spiral stair, ready to resume the outward work of the day, polishing the brass reflectors, oiling the gears, and later, to watch the winged visitors circle the inlet. But for this moment, the quiet intimacy of wax and ink lingers, a reminder that even in solitude, a man's thoughts connect him to the distant, beating heart of the world beyond the rocks. In the pale light of early afternoon, the keeper made his way onto the narrow iron balcony that encircled the lantern room. A gentle sea breeze carried the briny scent of salt and seaweed up from the rocky shores below, ruffling the thin wool of his coat. He leaned against the cool railing, inhaling deeply as the sun climbed slowly westward, each beam dancing on scattered clouds that drifted overhead. Through the polished glass panes behind him, the great lens rested in silent readiness. Here, aloft amid the gull cries, he felt a kinship with the creatures that rode each passing gust. On this platform, so often the scene of his nightly vigilance and midday maintenance, he paused at last for a moment of simple observation. Before him lay a small cluster of rocky outcrops, jagged spines of granite thrusting up from the swirling tide. In calmer weather, these rocks formed the favored nesting grounds of gulls and terns alike, families gathering to hatch and rear their young. The keeper reached for his brass spyglass, worn smooth by long use, and lifted it carefully to his right eye. The metal barrel gleamed dully in the sun, a handsome companion to his solitary watch. He turned the focusing lens until the nearest islet filled the sight, tiny black and white shapes milling about shallow scrapes in the stone, delicate specks against the gray-green sea. He began to count the nests, one by one, marking each in his mind. A neat aggregation of 6 nests clustered on a ledge just above the high tide mark, a pair further to starboard, precariously balanced in a narrow fissure, another 3 hidden in a sheltered cleft. He paused, noting how the parent birds stood guard, bodies angled into the wind, wings drooping like folded sails. A single fledgling peeped, its downy feathers ruffled, toes clutching the rock with surprising strength. Each measured detail filled another line in the invisible ledger he kept of avian comings and goings. The day before, he had observed 5 nests there. Today, the count had risen by 2. This quiet record of nature's rhythms pleased him more than any log entry on storms or tides. As he lowered the spyglass, a sudden rasping caw interrupted the lull. A lone crow, its feathers as black as the stormy nights he so often endured, had perched upon the balcony's edge. It cocked its head, regarding him with beady eyes. For a moment, man and bird assessed one another in silent accord. The vigilant keeper, steward of light and safe passage. The cunning crow, opportunist of the cliffs. The crow crouched, ready to launch itself into the air, its dark silhouette outlined against the sea. Without a word, the keeper lifted one hand and raised his cap in a gentle but warning motion. The crow, perhaps surprised or unwilling to risk an altercation, spread its wings and flapped away, wheels of black lifting into the sunlit sky. With the intruder gone, the keeper smiled at the cacophony of gull cries that filled the inlet. A chorus of mews and shrieks rolled across the water, a living, breathing testament to life carried on in spite of his solitary vigil. He replaced his cap and retrieved from his pocket a stub of graphite pencil and his small leather-bound notebook, its cover softened by years of handling. Opening it to a blank page, he sketched the outline of a tern in mid-flight, a slender, graceful shape, wings angled sharply against the wind. He paused over each stroke, the gentle curve of the bird's back, the long tail streamers fluttering behind, the sharp point of its beak as it motioned toward some unseen fish below. His pencil danced lightly across the page, capturing movement and stillness in equal measure. He recalled the tern's relentless energy as it dipped and banked, fishing tirelessly for sustenance. He watched in admiration as one bird swooped low, talons barely skimming the water's surface, then climbed again in a sudden, joyous ascent. In his notebook, the keeper annotated the date and time, along with a few precise words. Turn album 15, 20 pairs on east ledge, 2 fledglings visible. He added the direction of the wind, northeast, steady at 15 knots, and a brief remark about the sea state, rippling waves, moderate chop. Though his primary duty lay with the lamp and the safety of mariners, these avian chronicles held equal importance in his quiet world. He straightened and closed the spyglass with a gentle click, then set it down on the railing. The gallery sloped gently toward the sea, offering a panoramic view of surf and rock. Below, foam flecked the water's crest, while farther out a thin line of white marked the offshore reef. The gulls wheeled overhead in graceful arcs, their calls rising and falling in a wild, unstructured symphony. For a time, he simply listened, letting the cries wash over him. Each caw and screech seemed to speak of timeless cycles, the turning of the tides, the passage of seasons, the unbroken chain of life on this wind-beaten coast. As he gazed, a family of young herring gulls ventured out from their nest, tentative at first, then more confident. One chick, nearly as large as its parents, hopped from rock to rock, testing its stubby wings. The keeper watched with gentle satisfaction, remembering how just weeks earlier those downy fledglings had lain in their scrapes, motionless but for the occasional stretch or peep. Now they tested their balance, exploring the edges of their world. He traced their progress with a nod and made a quick note in the margin of his sketch. Young gulls exploring, strong growth evident. The afternoon light began to soften, shadows lengthening as the sun inclined toward the horizon. The keeper leaned forward, elbows resting on the railing, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the squall of cries and the pulsing breath of the sea lull him into quiet reflection. Here, aloft and unhurried, he felt both small and integral to the grand pattern of nature. Though his days were filled with mechanical checks, logbook entries, and the burden of keeping a beacon burning, these interludes with the winged visitors offered a different kind of sustenance, an affirmation that life pressed on in myriad forms, even in the bleakest weather. A lone tern circled close, dipping and rising in wide ellipses. It called out, a clear, bell-like sound that rang above gulls' raucous clamor. The keeper opened his eyes and watched as the bird's white breast caught the afternoon glow. He wished to hold the moment in his memory, the sheen of its plumage, the pinprick of its eye, the silhouette of its flight against a late-day sky streaked with coral and gold. In his notebook he jotted a final note. Tern's song carries far in quiet air. Then he snapped the book shut and tucked it into his coat pocket. He paused again, surveying the inlet and the line of breakers beyond, aware that soon he would descend the winding stairs to tasks that still awaited him. Ledger balances, lamp preparations, supper. But for now, he allowed himself this gift of an unhurried watch, companioned by the seabirds whose rhythms he had come to know as intimately as his own heartbeat. He brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, folded his arms, and turned back to the tower's door. With one last glance at the buoyant company of gulls and terns, he whispered a quiet farewell. As he stepped indoors, the echoes of wings and cries drifted after him. In the lamp room, the polished brass gleamed in anticipation of the evening flame. Outside, the sea continued its timeless dance. The keeper lingered only a moment at the threshold, then closed the trap door softly, carrying with him the calm grace of those winged visitors. Their presence would remain in his thoughts throughout the late-day hours, a living reminder that solitude need never be silent, and that even on the most remote rock, life abounds in song and flight. Thus ended his afternoon communion with the birds, an interlude both fleeting and enduring, preparing his spirit for the contemplations and duties still to come. Outside the lighthouse, on a low bench of smooth, worn timber, the keeper settles as the sun descends toward the western rim of the sea. The tower behind him stands silent, its stone walls humming with the slow warmth absorbed throughout the day. The air remains soft, neither hot nor cold, and the bench's surface yields gently beneath his weight. He props one elbow on the backrest and tilts his head, letting the distant horizon draw his gaze. A subtle hush has fallen, an interlude between the bustle of daylight duties and the hush of night's approach. A thin breeze drifts in from the churning waters, carrying the sharp tang of salt and the faint whisper of seaweed. In his ears, he hears gulls calling high above the rocky outcrops and the soft susurration of waves lapping against the stones far below. Occasionally a single tern flits past, its wings beating in silent protest to the thinning light. He inhales deeply, tasting salt crystals on his tongue and feeling the breeze pepper his cheeks. It is a breath he savors, a moment that binds him to the endless rhythm of sea and sky. He loosens the lapels of his sturdy coat, shedding a small measure of the day's heat. His boots, scuffed at the toes and faintly stained by oil, rest planted firmly on the rough-hewn planks. With hands folded in his lap, he allows the steady beat of his pulse to settle. After hours of precise checks and careful polishing, this pause feels both earned and necessary. The world seems to slow, and he moves inside the quiet recesses of his own thoughts, drifting into a gentle reverie. Memories of past storms crest the edge of his mind, vivid as the lightning that once rent the sky. He recalls how, on a night not unlike this, thunder had rolled low and fierce clouds had swelled overhead. The lens chamber had rocked as waves collided with the sea wall, sending spray high above the gallery deck. He had labored to steady the mechanism, hands slick with oil and salt alike, heart pounding with the knowledge that mariners relied on his skill to guide them through darkness. In that moment, each rotation of the lens had felt like a small triumph over chaos. Those recollections drift into the ledger of his memories, tethered by inked lines and the rhythmic scratching of quill on parchment. He envisions the neat columns of his logbook, wind direction noted in slender strokes, barometer readings signed with a flourish, every entry a testament to order amid the tempest. Each recorded word had been a bulwark against forgetfulness, a promise that the lighthouse's guiding light would never falter. Even now, the weight of those written duties presses gently upon him, reminding him that solitude and responsibility walk hand in hand. Yet in this late afternoon calm, the same solitude becomes a companion rather than a burden. He recognizes a harmony in the hush, the measured sigh of the breeze, the distant cry of seabirds, the slow shifting of light across rock and water. His heart slows again, matching the steady pulse of waves far below. The burden of vigilance eases into a peaceful contentment. Here, between the labors of day and the vigilance of night, he finds a rare stillness, a moment suspended between two worlds. Across the inlet, a single fishing skiff drifts on the faint current, its small sail barely catching the wind. He observes its slow passage with quiet appreciation, imagining the boat's solitary occupant likewise lost in memory or prayer. Further out, the hull of a merchant brig dips gently in the rolling swell, its sails furled as it awaits the tide's favor. These distant vessels, though small and muted in the waning light, remind him of the greater tapestry in which his own vigil is but one thread. A cluster of gulls has alighted on a nearby rock, preening their feathers and preening again. Their white plumage gleams against the dark stone, and every now and then one nods its head as if in shared recognition of the lighthouse's silent sentinel. He watches them with a mild smile, recalling how earlier he had counted their nests along the crags, sketched turns in his notebook, and marveled at each new fledgling. In their carefree flight, he perceives a simplicity that tempers the weight of his own chosen seclusion. Faint echoes of his day's tasks drift back, the careful trimming of wicks in the lantern room, the gentle polish applied to each prism, the exacting checks of the tide tables by noonday. Even the methodical counting of rations in the storehouse seems part of a larger ritual, a chain of small duties that sustain both flame and keeper. In retrospect, the day has unfolded like clockwork, each chore leading seamlessly to the next, until now, when he can step aside and let the work rest at last. The light has dulled into tones of rose and violet, and shadows lengthen across the balcony floor. He rises slowly, stretching muscles made stiff by stillness. The bench creaks softly in protest as he shifts his weight. His breath comes in measured and deliberate rhythms, and in each exhalation he feels the final vestiges of tension drain away. It is time to return within, to prepare the evening meal that will warm him against the chill swift to follow. Before stepping inside, he pauses once more, hand resting lightly on the timber railing. The breeze has turned cooler now, each gust whispering of night to come. In the flicker of that moment, he senses a gathering hush, as if the sea itself has drawn back to watch. He breathes in the salt-tinged air one last time, committing the scene to memory. This bench, this sky, this precise angle of light, and then at last turns his back on the fading horizon. Behind him, the door to the lantern room stands ready to receive his next steps. The bench remains empty, a silent witness to his brief communion with solitude and sea. As he withdraws into the tower's interior, the low murmur of the waves climbs to fill the dusk, and the lantern room awaits the keeper's steady hand once more. Night approaches, beckoning him forward into the next chapter of his vigil, where flame and reflection will unite beneath the watchful eye of the widening darkness. The last faint tendrils of daylight drift through the narrow window panes of the keeper's small kitchen chamber, lengthening the shadows on the painted floorboards. In a corner, a stout cast-iron stove stands ready, its blackened surface etched with the marks of 100 meals past. The keeper, his coat folded over a nearby peg, loosens the linen shirt at his collar, rolls up his sleeves, and steps toward the simple wooden table that holds the day's provisions. He takes in the hush that already settles through the tower, a promise of evening quiet broken only by the muted susurrus of waves beyond the thick walls. On the table lie a sturdy chopping board, a well-worn paring knife, and a small pile of root vegetables he carried up earlier that afternoon from the supply storehouse. There are fat carrots, their orange flesh faintly speckled with earth, a handful of parsnips, a few waxy turnips, and a solitary onion, its dry outer skin crackling under the lantern's glow. He reaches for a damp cloth, wipes the board free of stray bits of husk and grain, and lays out the vegetables with a calm deliberation born of lifelong practice. He picks up the parsnip first, tracing the subtle ridges that run lengthwise along the root before setting its blunt end against the wood. With a measured grip, he brings down the paring knife in a steady motion. The blade sinks into the parsnip with a soft snap, releasing a faint, sweet scent of earth and early frost. He slices a thin disc, then another, the rhythm of the movement echoing in the quiet chamber. Each piece falls in a neat row, the pale flesh gleaming in the pale light of the single lantern hung above the stove. Next come the carrots, their vibrant orange a bright contrast to the muted tones of the walls. He peels one with a gentle turn of the blade, mindful of not cutting too deeply, so as not to waste any part of the vegetable. The shavings curl in delicate ribbons like discarded scrolls of amber parchment. He trims the parsnips into uniform lengths, then squares off the turnips, discarding any blemished sections. The onion is last. He slices it crosswise, and the first cut reveals its faint concentric circles. A soft, sharp fragrance rises. He pauses, breathes it in, recalls a passing thought of family kitchens far away, and then turns to the stove. The iron door of the stove opens with a low creak. Within, embers from the morning's hearth glow dull red beneath the grate. He scoops a handful of charred wood and shovels it toward the front, shifting the embers so that the flames flicker once more. The metal heats quickly, radiating a gentle warmth that embraces the chamber. He closes the door, then sets a heavy kettle of water on the flat surface above it, waiting for it to hiss and sputter into a rolling boil. He washes his hands over the small tin basin by the back wall, where he keeps a supply of fresh water drawn from the cistern at midday. He dries them on a rough linen cloth and then, with a pair of tongs, retrieves a small iron pot from the hook behind the stove. He adds a knob of butter salvaged from this morning's porridge, and as it melts, it spurts and froths, sending a buttery aroma to swirl beneath the lantern's glow. He lifts the lid on a jar of salted dried peas, stored since last autumn, and tips a measure into the pot before the butter can burn. The peas hiss and clatter, then soften in the melting fat. One by one, the keeper transfers the chopped vegetables into the vessel. There is patience in this process. He stirs gently with a wooden spoon, moving each carrot and turnip until it gleams bronze from the butter. He watches as the onion slivers turn translucent, releasing an earthy sweetness into the oil. From a small crate at his feet, he retrieves a stout bone, browned and dried, to lend a faint depth to the broth. He slips this into the pot, then covers it with water from the kettle, listening as the liquid settles and then begins to bubble. He adjusts the stove's air vent, coaxing the flame into a soft, consistent flicker. At his side is a tin of coarse salt and a pepper box. He seasons the stew with a deliberate scantness, knowing that in the gloom of evening one must avoid anything too strong for the belly. While the stew simmers, he sets about readying his tools for the impending dusk. Atop a narrow shelf rests the brass wick trimmers, their blades honed to a fine edge. Next to them lie spare lamp wicks bundled in yellowed parchment. He lifts the trimmers, feels their weight in his hand, glances at the worn leather strap that binds them, the same strap that kept them safe through many a tempest. Though he will not trim the lamp until he climbs the spiral stair to the lantern room, he gives them a small inspection here, a touch to each moving joint, a gentle squeeze to ensure the blades meet evenly. Then he lays them back, ready for the evening tasks to come. The kettle's whistle pierces the silence as steam torrents from its spout. He lifts it off the stove and pours a trickle into a chipped tin cup, then removes the bone from the stew and deposits it onto a saucer, its marrow long since spent. With a ladle, he lifts a spoonful of broth, watching the pale orange flecks of carrot drift in the liquid. The savory scent wraps around him like a familiar cloak. He carries the steaming ladle to the window, opens it a crack, and lets the cool sea breeze mingle with the steam. The wind brings with it the brine of the channel, distant gull cries, and a promise of nighttime watches. He returns to the stove, pours the contents of the ladle into a wide earthenware bowl, and, drawing a simple wooden stool close, settles himself before the meal. Outside, shadows pool at the edges of the tower. The sky has turned the color of bruised plum, and the horizon line softens to a thin silver. He leans forward, brings the bowl to his lips, and sips the broth. It is warm and sustaining, its flavors modest but honest. He tastes the sweetness of the carrot, the subtle bite of onion, the faintly nutty depth of the parsnip. A quiet peace settles over him as he takes another spoonful, then another, until the bowl is left with only a few languid droplets. The steady hiss of the stove and the lull of the sea beyond form a gentle accompaniment. He allows himself a moment of untroubled reflection, recalling the day's small triumphs, the cleaned prism, the tight seal on the door, the ledger entries kept neat, and acknowledging the tasks yet to come. As dusk deepens, he rises and carries the empty bowl back to the stove, places it upside down on a trivet to cool, and fetches a small pan of soapy water. Washing dishes by lantern light is a ritual of its own. He fills the basin with warm water, stirs in a bar of soap ripped from a long-sealed box, and swirls it into froth. The sponge, worn smooth, glides across the surface of the bowl, lifting away the last oily traces. He rinses each piece under a trickle of clean water, then sets it upon a rack cut from offcuts of driftwood. He uses whatever scraps of canvas remain to wipe the counter bare of crumbs and drips. As he works, a shutter creaks in the breeze, allowing a faint gust to carry the last whiffs of cooking from the chamber. Satisfied that the room is aired and tidy, he extinguishes the stove's flame by closing the air vent, an act that sends the embers to a simmering hush. He stands for a moment in the center of the room, gazing at the simple orderliness of his domain. The stove cooling to a charcoal glow, the pot and pan aligned on their hooks, the table clear save for the lantern that now anchors the chamber in its soft, steady light. Soon he will boil fresh water, trim the wick, and climb the stairs to ignite the beacon for the night. But for this fleeting instant, he simply inhales the mingled scents of sea and hearth, the thickness of responsibility, and the modest comfort of a solitary meal. As the lantern's flame shivers in the gentlest draught, the keeper allows himself one last restful breath. Beyond the walls, the tides are shifting, and the ocean prepares for its nocturnal tide. Inside, all is calm. The evening meal complete, the dishes washed, and the cooking hearth asleep, he steps toward the spiral stair, his mind attuned to the tasks that the darkness will demand, mindful of the light he must soon kindle. Yet he carries with him still the warmth of the stew and the quiet contentment it brought, a simple solace to see him through the night watch ahead. The late afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows of the lantern room, painting long amber shafts across the polished wood of the gallery floor. Outside, the horizon brimmed with pale gold, the last warm breath of daylight slipping between ragged clouds that drifted in from the west. Inside, the keeper moved with deliberate calm, conscious that this interval between evening meal and nightly vigil was a threshold, an hour in which every gesture mattered, each precise motion bringing the great beam to life. He began by laying out his tools on the small workbench by the central lamp base. A stout pair of brass-handled scissors lay beside a length of cotton wick, freshly measured and carefully unwound from its spool. A soft bristled brush, reserved only for dusting the ceramic reflector dishes, rested on a folded cloth. In the margin of his mind, he replayed the day's events, the steamed porridge, the midday logs, the cautious weather observations, and now turned his attention wholly to the machinery of light. In measured steps, he lifted the hinged cover of the reservoir and withdrew the spent wick stub from yesterday's watch. His thumb and forefinger pinched it gently, drawing the charred length from the brass holder. A brief inspection revealed the telltale ring of soot that marked hours of burning. The metal shone where he had trimmed the edges only that morning. With the precise cut of his scissors, he removed the blackened end until pure white cotton appeared, the fresh outlet through which the oil would rise. From the spool, he measured a length just sufficient to stand an inch above the wick tube, neither too proud to smoke nor too shy to flame eagerly. Next he turned his attention to the reflectors. Over the course of each day, a fine layer of salt spray and lingering dust gathered on their surfaces, slightly dulling the once brilliant sheen. He dipped the soft brush into a small dish of water and chalk solution, a mixture prepared with the gentlest proportions to avoid scratches, then, in graceful strokes, swept away the residue. Each ceramic facet revealed its perfect curve again, ready to channel and intensify the coming glow. As he worked, he thought of how these quiet hours of polishing, trimming, and aligning all contributed to the greater purpose, guiding ships safely past the hidden shoals that prowled beneath the sea's dark face. When the reflectors gleamed, he stood back and lifted the brass frame, easing it back into place around the lamp's central column. The prisms clicked softly, their edges kissing one another in a tight embrace. He felt the familiar weight under his palms and knew the lens would turn smoothly when set in motion, its glass faces catching the flame and throwing it into the gathering dusk. The oil reservoir awaited next. From a nearby shelf, he retrieved a freshly filled canister of whale oil, the pale, viscous liquid that he had filtered and measured that morning. Holding a funnel against the open top, he poured steadily, listening to the gentle gurgle as the reservoir accepted its charge. A few stray droplets clung to the spout. He wiped them away with an old linen rag folded to a feather's thickness. Satisfied that no air pockets remained, he sealed the reservoir with its screw cap, twisting it until the threads engaged with a reassuring click. A hush fell over the lantern room as he reached for the matchbox, a small, well-worn case of friction matches that had served him for countless evenings. He withdrew a single match, his fingers steady despite the flicker of anticipation in his chest. A careful strike along the striker's strip sparked the match head to life, and he lifted the tiny flame toward the wick. Immediately, the oil sprang into gentle combustion, the new wick flaming bright and unwavering. He adjusted the flame height by turning the wick knob just so, coaxing a flame neither too timid nor too high. It curved upward, a slender yellow tongue that seemed to lean eagerly toward the night. A soft hiss filled the room as the oil vapor met open air, and the keeper inhaled its faintly oily tang, a scent he knew as well as the salt that clung to his clothes. The mirror facets captured that flickering glow, reflecting and refracting it into a steady beam of light. He watched as the first glow reached each prism in turn, then stepped back to observe how the light pooled upon the glass dome above his head. It glowed like captured moonlight, as translucent as water pressed between panes. With the lamp now fully ignited, he turned his focus to alignment. He crouched at the edge of the gallery balcony, where heavy wooden shutters framed a widening circle of view. Drawing upon muscle memory, he eased the lantern into its rotational carriage, then released the brake lever. Almost imperceptibly at first, the lens began to turn. He watched the band of light sweep slowly across the sea, noting the angle at which it brushed the rolling crests of approaching swells. A turn of a small adjustment screw altered the horizontal tilt ever so slightly, and he let the lens rotate once more until the beam struck rock and foam at just the correct trajectory, a line of safety drawn across tumultuous waters. The dusk deepened. Beyond the glass walls, distant clouds took on the violet tones of approaching night, and the wind carried a sharper edge. The reflector's glow cut a silver path across storm-tossed waters, tracing the patterns of waves hidden beneath the dark. In this moment, the keeper paused. He allowed himself a breath as deep as the ocean itself, a silent acknowledgement of the responsibility he bore. Each ship that passed these shores counted on the stability of this light, this single point of unwavering flame carved against the coming darkness. Lastly, he crept once more to the gallery door and closed the heavy trap door overhead, sliding the bolt with a firm push. The lock clicked home, sealing off the lantern room from the open gallery. He checked each latch, confirming that no gale force gust could intrude upon the lamp's chamber until he returned. The final bolt secured, he straightened and cast one more glance at the lamp, a steady ruby point in the growing night. Stepping back, the keeper allowed his shoulders to ease. He set aside his tools, wiping each one clean on a rag before returning them to their hooks and drawers. The polished surfaces of brass and glass no longer drew his eye. They existed now only to serve. Outside, the beam continued its rhythmic sweep, a silent sentinel across the churning sea. With the beacon primed for dusk, he lingered a moment at the threshold between lamp and world. Beyond the shutters, the first star of evening gleamed. Somewhere out at sea, a vessel might be reorienting itself to the safety of this guiding light. In the hush of that lantern room, the keeper felt both small and infinite, a solitary figure in a tower of stone, yet part of something vast and necessary, a quiet guardian whose duty bridged man and nature, night and day. As he descended the narrow spiral stair toward the warmth of the keeper's quarters, each footfall echoed with purpose. The lamp behind him cast its glow outward, sweeping again and again across the dark water, relentless and true. And so the evening watch began. Under the heavy weight of a cloud-choked sky, the lantern room sits in near silence, save for the muted thunder that rolls like distant drums and the lapping of waves against the granite base of the tower. The keeper, recent from his final preparations at dusk, stands by the great Fresnel lens, its brass framework still warm from trimming and polishing. The glaze of rain has begun against the panes, each drop tracing a pale, winding path before settling into motes of silver that quiver in the lamplight. In these deep hours, solitude is both companion and challenge, and the keeper welcomes its quiet certainty as the tempest gathers might. He moves slowly to the circular window that overlooks the western horizon. Pressing his palm to the cold glass, he watches a sudden ribbon of lightning fork across the sky, illuminating the endless swell of the sea. The waves, lit momentarily by that brilliant flash, rise like ghosts one moment and fall into shadow the next. He leans forward, noting how the crests claw at the wind, and considers the vessels that might find themselves at the mercy of such a storm. In the fleeting brightness, the gallery rail gleams wet, and the horizon's edge appears almost vertical, as though the sea might tip over into the sky. He inhales the sharp tang of salt and oil, and for a moment stands utterly still, heart beating in time with that distant lightning. The mechanized clockwork that rotates the lamp ticked on steadily until a slight stutter caught his ear. A subtle hesitance, like a pulse that has lost its rhythm. He knows the mechanism too well, the cogs honed, the bearings oiled, the ratchet poised to guide the beam across the tossing waves. Yet tonight, friction has overtaken lubrication. Carefully, he turns from the window and adjusts the throttle wheel on the drive shaft, listening for the smooth hum to return. When it does not, he unclenches his gloves and, by the flickering light of the lamp, reaches out to the gear assembly. Fingers pressed to the cold brass, he loosens a screw, draws the lens slightly forward, then eases it back into place so the drive will catch the cog cleanly. The lamp pauses, hesitates again, and then resumes its sweep, sending a slender beam of golden radiance spinning across the roiling waters. His face, reflected in the curved glass of the lantern, is half lit and half lost in shadow, determination set in the lines around his eyes. Chill air seeps in through the gallery shutters, carrying with it the scent of brine and the distant roar of the open sea. From his shoulder hangs a heavy blanket, damp already from earlier spray, and he wraps it around his shoulders as if to ward off the night itself. The wool absorbs moisture and clings, but he welcomes its weight and comfort. He settles into the high-backed chair set near the logbook table, its wood scarred with the marks of years of service. His wet coat drips onto the worn flagstone beneath, and throughout the room, oil lamps tremble with the breeze that creeps through the slight cracks in the masonry. Before him, the open logbook lies half-inked. A fresh quill rests at its side, the nib still dull with the last notation made when the lamp was first lit. Now, with careful strokes, he records the hour. 11 bells past 8, date and tide, barometric reading elevated by the pending storm front, wind veering from south-southeast and rising. Each letter forms as deliberately as the notes of a somber chant. Between entries, he pauses to listen, thunder's cadence rolling in waves of low rumble, the steady hiss as rain batters the outer glass, and beneath it all, the undulating roar of water against stone. A flick of lightning follows each thunderclap in a slow, ominous succession, marking time by nature's unpredictable clock. Occasionally, he glances upward where the storm's fury is at its most violent. Flashes fracture the sky in quick succession, revealing the white-capped foam racing toward the cliffs like herds of desperate cattle. In those brief illuminations, the lens seems to stand sentinel in its brass cage, a lone eye staring unwaveringly into the dark. He feels the tower shudder beneath the force of wind and spray, as though the sea itself seeks entry, yet the stone walls stand firm. He closes his eyes and lets the vibration of the structure settle in his bones, a reminder that this sanctuary of light must endure, must hold fast against the elements. He turns back to the logbook, careful to note the number of flashes of lightning over each quarter hour, their frequency a guide to the storm's intensification. His pen pauses when a particularly bright fork splits the sky, sending a wash of white through the lantern room. For an instant, every contoured facet of the Fresnel lens glitters as if bedecked with jewels. In that still second, he thinks of calmer nights recorded in earlier chapters. Gentle sea mist curled around the balcony at dawn, the drifting gulls of midday, and is struck by the contrast. Yet the duty remains unaltered, to keep the flame unwavering, to chart the tempest so others may read its portents ashore. A fresh gust rattles the shutters, prompting him to rise and pat them closed. His footsteps are soft on the thick woolen mat by the door. He checks each latch, presses the damp wood until it settles against the frame, and feels the wind sigh as if thwarted in its path. Returning to the chair, he draws in a measured breath, settling the blanket more snugly around his knees. In the narrow circle of lamplight, he tilts his head to hear the faint grinding of the rotation once more. All appears sound. The lamp's radiance remains true, a faithful pulse against the sea's throbbing blackness. By now, the pages of the log are speckled with droplets of rain that found their way through minute fissures, and the ink has begun to blur at the edges. He tilts the book at a precise angle, letting the moisture drift away from each line. Then, with a soft cloth, he tampers the quill and sets it to dry. In place of writing, he takes a small compass from his coat pocket and aligns it with the cardinal directions marked on the weather chart. He compares the direction of the wind's roar against the compass needle's steady pointing, confirming that the storm holds true to the predicted track. Mustering a faint nod of satisfaction, he returns the compass to its brass housing and lets the logbook rest closed until the next watch. In the fullness of this midnight hour, time ceases to rush. Moments stretch long and slow, each breath drawn in unhurried acknowledgement of the sea's power. He recalls the labor of earlier hours, polishing the metal reflectors until dawn, checking tide tables at midday, repairing shutters against the salt. Each task, methodical and precise, prepared him for nights like this. Now, as the storm bellows around him, he feels the sum of every trimming, every record, every tightened bolt coalesce into this single act of vigilance. He is the lighthouse incarnate, a living beacon of reassurance to any sailor scanning the wastes of waves. All at once, another peal of thunder erupts so near that the light in the lantern flickers. He bristles at the proximity, though the fire does not extinguish. Calmly, he stands and approaches the lamp, passes a gloved hand over the reservoir to ensure warmth there, and then gently adjusts the flame's height with the wick's control. The glow steadies in answer, brighter and more resolute. He smiles faintly, an unspoken promise to those who traverse the waters, that the light will not fail, come tempest or calm. Turning again to his chair, he allows himself a moment of quiet reflection. The storm's rush grows steadier now, as if cresting. Beyond the glass, curtains of rain swirl like great banners in the wind, and the sea lifts itself high before colliding with the granite shore. In the heart of this chaos, the keeper feels a singular peace. His mind drifts to the dawn to come, the final entries he will make, the morning mist he will greet above the waves, the simple porridge that will sustain him once more. But for now, he remains at his post, embracing fully the slow vigil that night demands. In the lantern's glow, he watches the storm's final crescendos, notes the barometer's slight fall, and listens to the thunder's last, resonant toll. Then, stone by stone, wave by wave, the storm loosens its grip. The wind dies back to a shuddering sigh, the rain becomes a gentle patter. He rises, shoulders uncoiling the weight of the blanket, and crosses to the large, round window one last time. Moonlight, pale and measured, peeks through ragged clouds, casting ghostly light upon the foam-strewn sea. The lamp's beam, undimmed, sweeps out into the calming waters, a steadfast sentinel in the veiled hours before dawn. And there, in the hush that follows the storm, the keeper's watch endures, unwavering, until the morning tide calls him once again. When at last the hands of the clock converge upon the witching hour, the keeper lifts his quill from the inkpot and allows the final line to settle into the heavy paper of his ledger. The wet glimmer of freshly inscribed letters dries in the hush of the lantern-lit chamber. He tilts the volume closed with a faint click of binding and breathes a soft, contented sigh, a small benediction upon the day's unbroken routine. Every entry, from the first pre-dawn observation to the storm's final roar, stands witness to hours bound by duty and solitude. By the dwindling glow of a single rushlight, he glances about the room, taking in the scattering of tools and charts that have kept him company since sunrise. A brass tack protrudes from the plaster wall, half hidden by shadows. From it dangles the stub of a dusty oil measure. On the low shelf, neatly stacked wicks await tomorrow's trimming. With gentle movements, he returns each item to its appointed place. The stout keyring slides back into a small wooden bowl. The stub of chalk is laid beside the tide charts, and the battered spyglass is cradled on a cushion of cloth, safe from the damp and cold. His fingers close around the forged iron handle of the storeroom door. He extinguishes the rushlight, its wick smoldering, and steps inside. Within the storeroom's dim recess, rows of earthenware flasks and steel canisters stand shoulder to shoulder, containing the whale oil that will keep the beacon alive through another night. He checks the lock, one twist of the bolt, then another, until the door stands sealed. Outside, the barrel of lamp wicks leans quietly against the wall, its contents safe beneath lock and key until dawn's first requirements. A brief watch through the narrow window assures him that the lighthouse lantern, its fire tended, sends its reassuring pulse into the darkness. Each rotation casts a steady arc of light upon the churning sea below, a promise to all who sail that a steadfast hand guides the sentinel. The waves thunder against the base of the rock with indomitable insistence, but within these stone walls, the keeper finds an unexpected harmony in their relentless cadence. He gingerly removes his boots, their leather soles worn smooth by countless ascents up the spiral stair, by years of footsteps echoing like a metronome down these wooden boards. Their place by the door is familiar. A pair of dark shapes fit snugly in the shallow depression of the floor. A soft exhalation issues from him as he unlaces each foot, mindful of the small complaints of salt and moisture he carried all day. He props his feet upon the threshold, feeling the grain of the boards beneath his toes. Then, with methodical slowness, he gathers his coat from the iron peg beside the hallway arch. The coarse wool hangs heavy there, cold to the touch. He drapes it over a hook, straightening its collar and smoothing the folds with easy motions, as though setting in place both garment and memory of the day just past. The chamber beyond beckons with a faint glow. A single lantern stands on a low desk, its golden sheen muted by the thick glass panes. He crosses the threshold on unshod feet, his coat resting against the doorpost. It is in this space that he pauses, breathing the mingled scents of lamp oil, parchment, and sea spray. The logbook lies open where he closed it, its pages faintly stained by oil and ink. The sound of distant waves is muffled here, but in a corner, the wooden rocker creaks under its own weight, as if reminding him of the comfort it offers. He settles into the rocker, drawing his legs up beneath him and wrapping his arms around his knees. Through the shuttered window, the wind flutters the heavy drapes, sending a ripple of sound down the wooden shutters. It is a lullaby of sorts, one born of briny gusts and rock-bound hushes. He closes his eyes, allowing his shoulders to lower, his breath to deepen. Each exhalation carries away the tension gathered from trimming wicks, polishing prisms, and cataloging the ceaseless dance of sea and sky. In the flicker of the lantern's flame, he recalls the slender thread that has drawn the day together. The rhythmic climb of the stairs, the steady hum of the rotation gear, the careful measurement of oil, the quiet pen strokes recording wind shifts and sea states. Even the smallest tasks, dusting salt from a lens, adjusting a shutter's catch, counting the candle stubs in the storeroom, have joined to form a mosaic of purpose. In that reflection, he finds peace. When fatigue at last unlaces the cords of his concentration, he rises slowly, leaving the rocker to its gentle sway. He blows out the lantern, watching as the flame retreats into the glass, then hovers, like a moth caught in a trap, before darkness swallows it whole. The hush deepens. Only the muted rumble of waves and the sigh of the wind persist. He crosses back to the hallway, every step measured so as not to wake the walls themselves. At the foot of the stair, a lantern in a small niche remains unlit, ready for morning's tasks. He does not pause by it. Instead, he ascends 2 steps and peers through a crack in the shutter at the gallery above. The lens stands still, motionless in the absence of daylight and watchful hands. It sleeps now, but he knows that in mere hours it will awaken, its prisms alight with purpose once more. At the last landing, he lifts the trapdoor key from his pocket and returns it to the iron ring on the wall. The trapdoor to the lantern room is secure, the beam of the Fresnel lens resting vertical, awaiting oil and flame. He does not linger. He descends the final flight and reaches his small chamber, where a modest pallet of blankets lies upon a simple stool. A single woolen coverlet is folded back, revealing coarse linen sheets that have known the imprint of worn shoulders through many nights. With deliberate slowness, he strips away the day's garments, his shirt and breeches folded and laid atop a low chest, his stockings removed and set to air upon a slat beneath the window. He slips between the folds of linen, the blankets enveloping him in their textured warmth. The wind has stilled its tantrums, though a faint whisper persists, skirting along the wall and through the shutters. He lies there in silence, staring at the dark timber ceiling overhead. Memories of the day drift through his mind. The gleam of polished brass at dawn, the reassuring arc of the lamp's sweep, the quiet companionship of ledgers and charts. He thinks of mariners far out to sea, guided by his solitary watch, and of the constant dialogue between himself and the elements. A calm settles over him, equal parts weariness and satisfaction. As his breathing slows to the pattern of the tide, he recalls the first entries he will make at tomorrow's dawn. Wind shifts, sea swell, the faint glow on the eastern horizon. Even now, in this final hour, he feels the pulse of the lighthouse throbbing through the rock and mortar beneath him. It will not rest, nor will he, until the cycle resumes again, just as ceaseless as the waves, just as reliable as the rising sun. And so he drifts, the last lantern snuffed, the ledger closed, the storeroom locked, the boots tucked away. In the hush of shuttered windows and slumbering walls, the keeper's mind wanders between dreams of storm-tossed seas and the promise of another day's devoted vigilance. The wind whispers through the cracks, a faint applause for a lone soul who keeps the light burning bright against the dark. At the edge of consciousness, he hears the sea's lullaby. At the edge of dawn, he will awake once more. But for now, logging off and seeking rest, he surrenders to quiet, and the lighthouse stands sentinel, guarding his dreams.